strategy, looking both at the foundational industries and at some of the growth-enhancing sectors earmarked by the government for further investment. I'm absolutely delighted that colleagues from across the steel industry have been able to join us today. Mr. Nair, perhaps I could just start off with you. President Trump has just slapped tariffs of 25% on UK exports of steel and aluminium. Tell us, how is this going to hurt your business and how do you want the UK government to respond?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to you and the rest of the committee. Yes, we've heard and we've seen President Trump slap those tariffs. So there are two ways in which it's affecting not just us, but the industry in general in the UK. One is obviously we have our interests in steel supplying into the UK, and specifically for Tata Steel, it's close to about $100 million worth of exports into the UK in products that are specifically not made in the US, so for which we have, for the last so many years, have had exclusions and exemptions, and they're basically in packaging steels and tubular products for oil and gas. That's basically where we are. So that's one aspect of the impact of the tariffs for us. The other more significant impact is because of the trade, because of the tariffs and the counter tariffs which are being put up by the rest of them. We have a huge amount of diversion from other parts of the steel industry which is flowing into the UK. And that has had a far more detrimental impact into the UK than, let's say, our business as such in terms of what we are supplying into the US.
Just to be clear, is your view that your US business will be hurt by these tariffs?
We think, because it has kind of spooked the customers. Customers have no clarity on whether these exemptions will continue, though there are indications that it will, but it's not clear. So the customers are spooked, and the customers are wanting to go to other suppliers to make sure that they don't get caught in the tariff warfare in some sense. So customers are already talking to us and wanting to cancel orders, and in some cases are asking us for compensation for potential orders. So besides the 100 million, there's also the impact of compensation for lost business for them.
So your customers are already considering cancelling orders?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Let me just come back to you on responses. Mr. Bell, what's the impact on your business?
Thank you, Chair. Similar to Rajesh, really. So there's two aspects to it. Firstly is our direct impact. So we supply around 50,000 tonne of steel into the US markets. Some of that is product that cannot be made anywhere else, and we are sole suppliers to those customers. Others are products where there is an exemption in place in the short term until June 2025, and then some of our other products that there are domestic producers. So if I take those in turn, the products where there are domestic producers, we've had to exit that business immediately, and similar, we've got customers that are concerned about the impact of the tariff and at the moment are considering order cancellation.
Let me just clarify that. So you too have got customers who are considering cancellation of orders?
Correct.
Have any cancelled orders yet?
Not as yet, no.
Just considering still?
Correct.
Yeah.
And then we've got some customers where, as I say, we are the only supplier, sole supplier status into those customers. They have told us that they will now start making moves to purchase that steel elsewhere. It will take them 9 months to develop tooling capability with domestic producers. So albeit it won't hurt us immediately, we anticipate that there will be damage done in circa 9 months' time. One customer in particular, we supply 6 products to them, and they've told us they've already started tooling development with new suppliers for 3 of those products. And then, as Rajesh said, there's the indirect impact of the potential diversion. As we see the European Union take action, we would like to see the UK government take similar action to ensure that any steel that was destined for the US that could now be diverted into other open markets, that we take measures to protect that potential diversion.
And Mr. Bill, like the Tata perspective, do you think that the bigger damage will be done through diverted steel coming into the UK?
That's our biggest concern at the moment, yes.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Nair, have you got a sense of how bad the impact is going to be on sales, let's say in the next 12 months? Have you got a sense of how big the damage will be, both to sales and profits?
Yes, it's going to be significant, Chair.
It's going to be significant.
It's going to be significant, simply because there are two things that are happening. One, like Allan said, we have the European Union looking to impose safeguard measures. So what's happened there is the prices in the European Union has started to move up. And today we anyway have got it now, the UK prices are at a discount now even to the European prices. In the last year, besides the tariff, in the last year we have seen prices in the UK decline, especially for flat products, by over £200 a tonne, through the year. And this is further worsened where European Union prices are now at least £60 more than the UK prices. Besides the impact of the large volumes that our customers, some of our customers are looking to book out of geographies that are now diverting steel that was potentially destined to the US.
I see.
It's going to be a huge impact, both in terms of the overall business, in terms of the top line, and it's also a massive impact in terms of the profitability of the business, which is far more damaging than just the volume loss.
Yeah. Mr. Bell, what's your damage assessment?
Yeah, so I think similar. We've not put a number to it at this particular point in time, but we expect the potential for diversion will do significant harm to potential sales from British Steel.
So you must be quite angry about this?
Disappointed. I think we would kind of suggest that we're disappointed with the approach that's been taken.
So how do you think the UK government should react? I mean, do you think the government has reacted well? Has it been too slow? Would you have preferred them to have avoided this in the first place?
I guess we see the efforts from the department to try and get exemptions for the UK into the US market. So I think that's positive action that we're seeing. In terms of the response on potential for diversion, I think absolutely we would like to see swift action being taken, and we're seeing that swifter action, I would describe it, being taken across the EU to review existing safeguarding measures and look at opportunities to tighten those safeguarding measures to protect the European Union from those potential diversions that we've talked about. So absolutely we would like to see the government move faster on reviewing at least the existing safeguarding measures that are in place for the UK.
What's your confidence in the Trade Remedy Authority moving at the right speed and producing the right answer?
So we work closely with UK Steel and the Trade Remedies Authority to continue to, as I say, work with them to identify opportunities. I've got to say, and I think we're always going to say, that we would prefer things to move faster. So absolutely we would like to see kind of pace increase.
Okay, Mr. Nair, what's your perspective on how the UK government should respond?
Very similar, Chair. Disappointed, but to be fair, we've had some very good conversations with the DBT and with the ministers. We've kind of explained to them the situation and the need for speed, in some sense, to take actions. I think the government is aware, cognizant of what is required to be done. But I guess in these kind of things, you've got to find the right balance between a quick remedy and long-term implications. So I suppose that's a place where the government is in. But I'm hoping that very soon we will have some short-term measures in place to prevent the damage or to arrest the damage that is currently happening.
Do you think we should be slapping retaliatory tariffs on United States product?
Well, I'm not sure that that's a way to go, because I think, as we've been talking, it's more to do with the impact of the diversions that is happening into the country that we need to take care of, because the UK steel industry over a period of time has declined to a very small value. So we're not a big steel consuming country. So we've got to act in a manner in which we protect and safeguard the industry in a way in which the incumbent players can continue to do business, and also the customers get a fair deal at the end of it all.
Okay.
So it's got to be the right balance for them. So it has to be some short-term measures to protect what we have in the country, rather than, I suppose, retaliatory measures.
Yeah. Okay. Alasdair, how are your members feeling about what's happened last week?
I think they're very concerned. We are worried about what this means for jobs and for the sustainability of the industry. This is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea for the US, just as much as it is for us. There's no doubt about that.
Are your members angry about what President
Yes,
Trump
they
is
are angry. Of course they're angry. They're worried about their livelihoods and the future of their plant and their communities as well. It's not a situation we want to be in. I would say I think the government are working extremely hard to try and secure these exemptions. The business secretary did meet with my union immediately after the announcement and gave us some reassurances that was the case. But like my colleagues to the right, our biggest concern is trade diversion and all this steel that was going to the US now floating around the world looking for a home. And we're concerned that we may be more at risk and open than other markets, in particular the EU. We know that the EU is likely to publish their EU Steel Action Plan this week, and as part of that, they're likely to announce that they're tightening safeguards from the start of April. So we need to move extremely quickly and decisively to make sure that our trade defences are at least as strong as the EU's. That's really, really important. And yet the concerns about the pace of the TRA, I'd certainly echo that.
So that's the test. It needs to be as strong as the EU's defences, and it needs to be in place by April, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Bolton, what's your sense of how the industry as a whole is feeling?
Well, they'll be, as my colleagues have said here, they'll be extremely disappointed. I think there's a concern that we're not exactly sure how this is going to pan out at the moment, and I think that will lead to a lot of uncertainty with various customers as not quite knowing where to jump and how to jump. I think that there's recent history around the 232 application in recent years when the same thing happened, and maybe the scale of the impact was not as great as people were expecting. A lot of the products, so for companies not represented here today, for example, Liberty and their aerospace products, they can't make those anywhere else, and so essentially the price was passed on, which will happen in a lot of the cases where the material is not actually made, not made in the USA. So I think there's clearly a balancing act to be taken here politically on how to actually position the UK again vis-a-vis future sort of trade agreements that may come in place.
Would you recommend retaliatory tariffs against the United States now?
I don't think I would at this moment in time. I think I would just wait and see, given it's very difficult to predict where President Trump will go with this, but I think we need to sort of negotiate as good a position as we possibly can.
Okay, and so what's your confidence level in the Trade Remedy Authority coming up with the right answer at the right speed?
I think, no, low in terms of the speed. I think what has already been said,
It's a problem.
And we haven't, it is a problem, and I think we've been here before. So in terms of the protection that can be put in place, it needs to be in step with Europe, as my colleagues here have said. And you haven't asked us about CBAM as well, but that will probably be announced at the same time. That's a year at the moment. It's going to come in place in 26, and we're able to bring it in 27, and that could actually provide some additional protection as well.
So should we be trying to introduce the carbon border adjustment mechanism at the same time as Europe?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you. Charlie Maynard.
Thank you all. Mr. Bolton, you co-chair the steel, or you chair the Steel Sector Council. What do you see as the competitive advantages of the steel sector in the UK today? Where do you think we have particular advantages, and what would you recommend in terms of growing those advantages and making our steel sector more competitive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think clearly there's a lot. I mean, it's almost easier to answer the alternative to say that where there are certain issues that we're uncompetitive in, particularly energy costs and things like that. However, I think the strength is we have a strong market. So if we look at the work that was done, it's being updated at the moment as part of the strategy. Back in 17-18, we foresaw a sort of market around about 11 million tonnes in the UK, and if you measure that against the capacity we had installed, then that presents opportunities. With the transformation that's taking place at the moment, there's an opportunity to reduce our costs. It obviously has to go hand in hand with reduced energy costs particularly, but then we should be in a good position to displace imports into the UK. And with a strong market, with that stronger market, it should be sustainable for the long run.
And just, can you say a bit more about how those costs can be reduced, and also what kind of particular market sectors you think we are most competitive in?
Well, I think, again, it comes back to all market sectors competitive at basically costs, so and as we move to electric arc furnace, then electricity costs, and I'm sure my colleagues will make the same point, are absolutely critical that we need to be in step with European competitors in that respect. But I think if you look at the demand and where there is consistent demand in the UK, then it will be around infrastructure projects that are funded, particularly public funded projects. Then there should be a significant demand there that the incumbent steelmakers should be able to take advantage of. And as well as energy costs, then the biggest problem at the moment for the incumbent steelmakers is that they don't have the volumes to cover their fixed costs. They're losing money because they're not actually producing at the high levels that they should be able to produce at.
Okay, and Mr. Nair, Mr. Bell, would you like to add anything in terms of where you see particular advantages or competitive advantages in the UK versus the global field, whether it's inside your companies or more broadly?
So I think, Mr. Maynard, we have the opportunity to make ourselves competitive. I think one of the reasons why we have found ourselves in this situation is because we lost the competitiveness, both for the steel industry as well as for the manufacturing industry in general. UK, when you look at the market segments in which we could potentially create that competitiveness, is, for example, construction. UK has been very strong in construction, and UK has also been has been in the forefront of using advanced products in construction. Similarly, there's a great opportunity that could continue in packaging steels, which is for cans and stuff like that. We've lost some of our competitiveness in automotive, but with the new investments that are coming in and with the drive to electric vehicles and the new gigafactories, etc., that are being set up, we potentially have an opportunity to create a competitive position in automotive. But having said that, we need to then put that back into the rest of the competitiveness for the rest of the industry. And the single most biggest element of lack of competitiveness is energy costs. I think the energy cost by far outstrips every other piece of every other element or factor of production. And I think if we can get the UK grid, fortunately, is from an electricity point of view, is fortunately greener than a number of other grids that you can find. You can argue the French grid and the other grids might be, or the Nordic grids might be better, but given the situation, it's fairly green. Our problem is both the wholesale costs of electrical energy and the network costs in delivering that energy to the consumers of large volumes of electrical energy. We need to fix that very quickly.
So just on that before coming, so we left the European single day ahead coupling energy trading system, kind of rejoining the European energy market, which would that be a help in terms of bringing down costs?
I think, Mr. Mayor, more than joining the energy thing, it is about creating the infrastructure to be utilizing the excess energy in European Union. I think our biggest problem is the interconnections between low-cost grid with the so we need to find a way to manage these grids well. If we can make the right investments in these interconnections, naturally the markets will work to give us the right cost of electrical energy.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess in terms of competitiveness and products, just repeating what John and Rajesh have said on construction, we should be able to be competitive in the construction market. And at the moment, British Steel, we believe we supply 3 of every 4 major construction projects within the UK. However, that is coming under significant pressure from customers that now require low embodied carbon steel product, which as an integrated steelmaker at the moment, we're unable to supply. So there is some short-term challenges whilst we move to decarbonise. In addition to construction, I would say rail is an area that, again, coming from British Steel, we supply 95% of the UK rail infrastructre and believe that to be of strategic importance to the UK and a sector where we should be and are competitive. And we supply rail up to 216 metres in length direct to trackside, so it's very difficult for anybody to come into the UK and be able to supply. However, the challenges, and again, as my colleagues have said, are primarily around industrial energy prices, where we are paying 50% more for our wholesale electricity than our neighbours in France and Germany.
I guess finally, so we were around a shipyard yesterday in Govan in Glasgow, and so lots of steel, mainly imported, I think, from Sweden and other. slightly I'm nervous about blowing in the wind in terms of defence is hot right now. Therefore, people are saying, well, let's build defence steels, high strength steels. What would you say? Anybody who'd like to comment on that in terms of would that be a wise thing to be investing in now, or not so wise? I'm curious.
Maybe I'll have a go at that. Clearly, the plate mill in DL would be central to supplying that. So I think you have to look at it in the wider context, because if you're supplying plate into that market, then you can supply plate into a wider market as well. So you have to take the whole plate market together, I would say. So I would answer your question, yes, I think it's worth investing in that, because I think there's a long-term market for plate in the UK. There's an underlying market of about 500,000 tonnes a year, and that's before you add in the renewable offshore demand. So and that's work that Alasdair's done and UK Steel have done to show that. And I'm sure that'll be one of the things that will probably come out of the work we're doing on the steel strategy. So I think, yes, it would be, if you're going to put plate capacity in place, and it's not just the plate mill, it's the slab capacity to actually support the plate, then you are put as much additionality as you possibly can into that, and make sure you can supply the steels required for the defence sector.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. My grandfather was a steel mill worker in Corby, in Northamptonshire, so I perhaps have a kind of nostalgic view of that. What I would say is my knowledge of it is not perhaps that great, and I think a lot of people in the public are a bit like that. So one of the questions that keeps coming up all the time is that with the closure in Scunthorpe, Britain loses its ability to create virgin steel. This seems to be kind of a holy grail, but how much does that actually matter? Is it important that we no longer make virgin steel? It's maybe one for you, Mr. Bolton.
Yes, it absolutely. Again, short answer to that is yes, it does matter that we keep that supply for a number of reasons. If we allow the blast furnaces to close, to be run down at Scunthorpe, then essentially we're cutting off that customer base. And if we are serious about wanting to maintain steelmaking in the UK, particularly for critical applications such as infrastructure construction, then we really need to try and maintain that supply chain, keep that supply chain in place. So I don't think it would be a good idea to change the source of steel or pause the source of steel while we're going through that transformation. And there are products, and I the question I get asked mostly is, can you make all the products you can out of electric arc furnace you make out of blast furnace? Theoretically you can, but there's a cost implication to doing that, and there's development work that needs to take place to make that happen. But in the short term, while that happens, you've got to maintain that supply, all the way through that supply chain. So I would argue it's really important to maintain the two blast furnaces. And the reason I say two blast furnace operation, having run that site in the past, one blast furnace, economically, from a business perspective, you're not covering the fixed costs. You need the volume from the two blast furnaces.
And you touched there on specialist products, and obviously defence, as we're hearing, is really important at the moment. And I was interested to see that the Americans seem to make the barrels for their Abrams tanks. They use electric arc furnaces for that. So you're saying that it is possible, but perhaps it's an expensive way of doing it.
It depends what the application is, and I think that is so Forgemasters produces those kinds of steels from electric arc furnace application already in Sheffield. So they produce those specialist steels, so it can be done. It'll be my colleagues will attest to on some of the more challenging flat products, deep drawn products that might be more difficult. Not impossible, but much more difficult.
Matt Weston.
Thank you. Obviously, you'll be familiar with the government's industrial strategy. It's the sectors that the UK government is looking for growth from and investment in. In the budget, it announced £2.5 billion for the steel sector. In your view, Mr. Bolton, in what way should that money be spent? What form? Where? And what sort of investment should we be expecting from the sector?
Okay. So I don't want to preempt the work that's taking place clearly in developing the strategy. But the way I see the strategy being developed is we're putting together a business plan that supports investment in the UK steel sector. And that £2.5 billion, therefore, should be to support and encourage further investment. It shouldn't be standalone to actually go all out just to spend on specific projects in isolation. So I'd see that being a way of, if you like, contributing to to investment by incumbents or third parties in the UK. And the kind of things I see it being invested in, again, without wanting to preempt, we've already covered some of them, but there are gaps in capability and capacity in the UK. And if I look at finished products first, then plate obviously comes into that, seamless tube might come into that category as well. But this work will come out of the strategy, the Hatch report that's been undertaken at the moment. And then you've got to look then what raw steel make that you need to support that and how you want to supply that. Whether that's with incumbent steel supply, I believe you should have domestic steel supply, and therefore how do you best supply that, and then how do you best support the infrastructure around that. So much has been said about investment in iron, something called direct reduced iron, which is like a raw iron product, and whether we should spend our money on that. I think the jury's still out on that. I think we need to assess that through the strategy. But I think it's in asset, to answer your question generally, it is actually to support investment from third parties. I see that $2.5 billion being applied.
Now, Mr. Bell, do you have any additional brief comments?
Yeah, so Mr. Weston, I think it's important to really, once we have a better view of where the industrial strategy is going and the sectors it's looking to support, our thoughts and my company's thoughts are this: it's good to have a certain amount of money reserved for steel, because steel will play an important role in developing or in progressing the outcomes that we want to get out of the industrial strategy, because it is about bringing industry and manufacturing, and steel willy-nilly will have to play a big role in it. Our thoughts on that is this: we should be looking at technologies that will help us deliver the products and goods of the future for our customers. As long as we are focused on making sure that our customers get the best in terms of the products they want for their own manufacturing, for their own industries, and for their customers, as long as we also address the issues that we have to deal with, which is primarily about decarbonization and sustainability and net zero and recyclability or circularity, as long as we are investing this money in getting the products of the future, we would have done a good job. Now, whether that means investing in downstream manufacturing or in upstream manufacturing is a choice we will need to make as we flesh out the industrial strategy. And we decide as a country what are the industries we want to support and grow into the future that will serve the UK for the next generation. And that is not yet clear. And therefore, to be looking at what really you should be investing it in and spending the 2.5 billion is a little premature at this stage. We made the first step as a company to turn the tide in the UK in terms of moving away from blast furnace steel making to electric arc steel making, because it will help us bring that competitiveness back as long as we can get the energy prices right. We've seen how the products out of electrical arc steel making can deliver all the promises for the future. Yeah, there are a set of products which you cannot, but most of the products that today the world uses can be produced by electric arc. For the UK, it is for us to put everything in place to make sure that we adapt this technology quickly, we fast track it, and make sure that our customers get the benefit of the new technology. And this is an opportunity for us to make steel and manufacturing work for the country.
Thank you. I guess first of all to say we were pleased to see £2.5 billion manifesto pledged to the steel sector. I think that's the first time that we've seen a government make that commitment. From a British Steel perspective, we would clearly like to see some of that £2.5 billion go towards the decarbonisation project at British Steel. The company cannot and will not survive without decarbonising, both from a financial sustainability point of view, but equally from the pressure that we face from the market to be able to deliver that low embodied carbon steel product. And as John and Rajesh have said, there is no viable business case for British Steel to undertake that investment with purely 100% private sector investment, so that will require support from government to enable that. And as we look broader outside of the UK, every single decarbonisation project that is taking place today is supported and co-funded by their respective governments.
Sorry, Mr. McDiarmid, briefly.
Very briefly, from our perspective, the most immediate and pressing priority for government to deploy the 2.5 billion towards is to securing the future of British steel. They've been in talks for a long time. They haven't delivered what we need to deliver. It's absolutely crucial that a future is secured for steelmaking at Scunthorpe, and to not do so would be a massive failure of government. We need a responsible and just transition plan towards low-carbon steelmaking at British Steel, and that needs to happen. We welcome Labour's ambition. The 2.5 billion is fantastic. We campaigned very hard for it, but it's time to start getting that money out the door before it becomes too late.
Let me just nail one thing, which goes round and round in circles in this place, which is whether we need a sovereign capability to produce virgin steel made only by a blast furnace. Is this something that uniquely is required because of defence capability? Mr. Nair, what's your perspective?
The short answer, if you ask me, Chair, it's not necessary.
Interesting.
Because technology has moved on, and I think we should look at the EAF technology and work towards making the technology work for us. Because when you talk about sovereignty, UK has, because of its industrialization, has huge amounts of scrap. It's the second largest scrap exporter in the world. I mean, people take the scrap out, 80% of it is exported. People take the scrap, convert it into steel and bring it back into the UK. We've got to get together to make sure that we utilize it ourselves to make the right steels. We have the opportunity to work on technology development and adaptation to make sure that, like UK has done in the past, I mean, steel was developed in the UK to a very large extent. We just need to put our act together to make sure EAF steel works for all the applications that we want. Yes, there will be specific areas where the quality of steel requirement will need us to adapt the EAF steel making appropriately, and that doesn't mean that you need to make virgin steels. You can get the required amount of iron which comes into the EAF steel making to give us the products that we want.
Okay, that's nice and clear. Thank you, Mr. Bell. What's your perspective on that question?
Absolutely aligned with Rajesh that we believe that the products that we make today through the integrated steelmaking route we can make in the future through the electric arc furnace route. There will be again a requirement for other oil-based metallics, most likely HBI, into our product mix, but we believe that we can buy that and import that HBI requirement rather than having the need for domestic capability to produce that.
Okay, thank you. Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Nair, today Tata Steel exports most of its scrap steel, so that could obviously be used by your new arc furnace. What are you going to do you think, as an organisation, to make sure you've got enough of that scrap steel to be able to have your demand met?
Tata Steel does not export scrap. As a company, we don't export scrap. The scrap is exported by the scrap processors and the scrap companies in the UK. In the UK today, we generate anywhere between 11 to 12 million tons of scrap, of which about 80% is just put into containers and exported out. These go into primarily to countries like Turkey, part of it to India, Bangladesh, etc. They get converted into steel. And to be fair, the Turkish have put EAF steel making, and they export high-end products which compete with our products in the UK market. So we need to find a way to make that, to incentivize that scrap which is going out to be value added within the country and utilized for the steel making in this country. And we're working with scrap companies to make that happen.
So how do we incentivise? What would you do you think, to incentivise these scrap companies to sell to you rather than selling overseas?
Yeah, so there are two ways of doing it. One is incentivizing in the way in which they get a fair return of the value add that we are creating. Okay, nobody is going to partner with us if they don't get a fair share of the value that we create. So that's the work which we need as a steel supplier, need to work with our scrap processors to make sure that the value pool is shared between the two companies. That's the one bit that we need to do, which means they need to make the necessary investments in processing the scrap, beneficiating the scrap for use in the electric arc furnace for high-end steels like what we are going to be doing for packaging steels and for construction steels, automotive steels. On the other hand, we also need to be able to disincentivize them from sending the scrap out for to markets which are just taking the scrap and converting. So there are these two parts which I think from a policy point of view, one from a policy point of view, one from a partnership point of view that we need to work through with our scrap partners.
And what would you say would be the government's role in assisting that process?
So the government's role should be in terms of creating the disincentivization piece, or rather make the scrap processors incentivized to work with the steel makers in the country. So things like the waste policies that we have, things like making sure that you can't export waste from the country. So it's about waste directives and making sure that these people with the scrap processors do not put these iron scrap into other markets.
Just worth adding that, yeah, I totally agree with what's said there. But again, as Alasdair mentioned earlier, the EU will be putting in place some regulations shortly. We expect them to announce it in April, Alasdair, I believe. Essentially, they're going to put export duties in place on scrap, particularly when it's shown that it's going to be exported to countries with lower environmental standards. So I think something, again, keeping in step with the EU, that is something we ought to be looking at and in step at the same time. Sorry.
Yeah. And Mr. Bolton, I suppose to you then, looking ahead, what other technologies do you think are coming down the pipeline which the UK could have a competitive edge in if we sort of push and have that government involvement a little bit more?
Well, it's linked to that, but it's come back to the question the Chair asked about sovereign iron capability, because I think the answers you got were from a blast furnace perspective. But I think also, just to re-emphasise that we should go as far back up the supply chain as we can, as that we can competitively can. So that means iron units to support the electric arc furnaces as well. So I'm not sure whether there is a business case there yet for that, but I think we should be looking to put, at some point you're going to have to import some part of the supply chain, whether it be iron ore, pellets or whatever, but we should try and do as much as we possibly can, because that iron ore potentially can come from at-risk regions of the world. So we need to be looking at how we do that. In terms of technologies, further technologies, I would guard against investing in brand new technologies in the fundamental steel making, because that is a long process and can be quite a painful process. But I would, having been recently involved in the foundation industry's challenge and seeing we do have, it's often said, but a world-class R&D capability when it all comes together in the UK. And some of the things that we're looking at, particularly crossover technologies between foundation sectors, from an industrial strategy, I would strongly recommend you look at these. So, for example, the cement industry, another huge carbon emitter, there are big synergies with the electric arc furnace capability that could be looked at and supported by government in terms of investment. So some of those synergies that support the business case for investment in steel, I think would be worth looking at.
Mr. Bell, any observations on that?
No, I think the points are well made in terms of scrap ultimately becoming a critical raw material.
Alasdair, anything to add?
No, other than we absolutely believe that primary steelmaking is a crucial sovereign capability. We also don't accept that all our blast furnaces have to close. Our members look around Europe and see blast furnaces staying open into the next decade and possibly the 2040s as well. So this rush to close our blast furnaces and cut thousands of jobs in the UK is very, very difficult for our members to see. So, blast furnaces can have a future in the short and medium term as part of a responsible transition plan, we believe.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I think following on from that piece there, I wondered if, Mr. Bell, you could just perhaps provide a bit more information on where you might be in regards to securing a deal with the government over the future of Scunthorpe's, and if there's any sort of issues outstanding that you're able to sort of share with the committee.
Yeah, so I guess, as I said, the company is under significant pressure to decarbonise, both from our customers and for financial sustainability point of view. We've gone through an extensive process of reviewing technologies from carbon capture and storage in our existing blast furnace through to DRI production that we've talked about, or HPI production, and ultimately electric arc furnace. And we have concluded that the only viable option for British Steel moving forward to decarbonise is to move to 100% electric arc furnace steel making. We believe that that will deliver an 82% reduction in our Scope 1 emissions, so we'll support that kind of net zero agenda. And as I talked about, this is a £2 billion project, we estimate, so it's not a project that the private sector is going to be able to implement without government support. We are, and it has been, the points been mentioned, have been in extensive negotiations bilaterally with the current government and the previous government. I would say that those negotiations are commercially sensitive at this particular point in time, and the timescales of an outcome, I would say, are unknown at the minute, unfortunately. I'm not able to share with the committee today what those timescales are, because I genuinely don't know them myself. But it is obviously something that we are under an enormous amount of pressure. Government are working with us, and we're working with our partners in the trade unions to accelerate that and get an outcome as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you. And so one of the areas that we've also heard about, if we can't go into some of that detail, was around the challenges around securing a grid connection for the furnaces. And one of the things I think, John, you'd mentioned earlier was that you sort of need two to make it commercially viable. So I wondered if Mr. Bell, you could comment on that situation alongside the grid, whether or not there's any discussions about that prioritisation, because I think time is quite critical for both of these, and then whether or not there is a sort of a crossover in perspective about, you know, whether one is going to be enough and what that future looks like for the steelworks.
Sure. So there was lots reported around some of the grid constraints, in particular into Scunthorpe, and at that point in time we'd received an offer to connect the site by 2034, which was clearly too late for us. But since, I guess, those media reports, there's been a huge amount of effort put in by the company, but equally supported by the Department of Business and Trade and the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero to find solutions to that problem. And I'm pleased to say that there is now a solution that would enable the Scunthorpe site to be connected within 3 years. 3 years. Which fits within our time frame and gives us the option to put 2 electric arc furnaces in Scunthorpe, to John's earlier point.
And do you think three years is that can you just about cope with that, or do you need greater certainty? And if you could have greater certainty, what would be your preferred time limit to be trying to get some clarity for the business?
So 3 years ultimately, it will take us 3 years to build the electric arc furnace, so the 2 timescales dovetail now quite neatly to meet that future project.
Thank you.
So is there a realistic scenario in which the blast furnaces stay open?
So I think the longevity of the blast furnaces is probably one of those very commercially sensitive points at the moment, and not something that we particularly can share, but at this moment in time.
Okay. Alasdair, did you want to come in?
Perhaps I can answer that from our perspective. Our experts, the union's experts, Syndex, have been working inside British Steel, working with British Steel's experts, reviewing the company's decarbonisation plans. There's a high degree of alignment. We agree, the unions agree with the company on the end state in terms of the low-carbon steel-making technology footprint for Scunthorpe, but we believe that there's a very strong case for keeping the blast furnaces going throughout the transition. There is a problem with carbon pricing. There's about £450 million of carbon costs that would have to be borne for the 3 years of the transition. And to bridge the gap between our plan and the carbon costs involved, and the company's plan would cost about £200 million, and that's why we've presented that to government, and we're asking government to mitigate the carbon impacts of our plan with an additional £200 million of support to protect thousands of jobs over the transition period.
I don't want to compromise Mr. Bell's negotiations, but your view is that there is a commercially viable solution which keeps the blast furnaces open?
If the government mitigates the carbon costs of the over the transition period.
And do you think that cost can be fitted within the £2.5 billion that government has earmarked for steel investment?
Well, yes, absolutely. But it's relief from carbon costs, so it's relieving the company of an obligation which they wouldn't otherwise pay in any event if the blast furnaces were to close. So we think it's something which certainly government could and should support.
Okay. Ms. Bance, did you want to come in on that point?
I don't know.
No. Okay, thank you. Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Chair. And this is to Mr. Nair. The government has said that we've got the electric arc furnace will reduce entire carbon emissions by 1.5%. Now, The government has said the electric arc furnace will reduce carbon emissions by 1.5%. Are you on course for the new furnace to be open and be operational by 2028?
Absolutely, by 2027.
Oh.
End of 2027 is our target to get the EAF operational.
And has the National Grid agreed a solid date for the connection?
Yes, we've been working with the National Grid way in advance of our announcement of the technological change. And to be fair to the National Grid, they have put it on a fast track and on a high priority, and we've been engaging with them. We're hoping they will deliver it in time for us to commission the EAF end of 2027. We're working hard, and we're hoping it will get delivered.
You told the Welsh Affairs Committee that you were losing over 1 million per day. How will the electric furnace change this?
The electric furnace will bring the competitiveness. So there are two parts to it. One, it will help us manage the raw materials that we were getting in from the rest of the globe. For every ton, nearly 2 tons of raw materials was being used. So a lot of the change that we're looking to bring about in the new paradigm is about bringing competitiveness to the steel making in Port Talbot. By the support that we are looking to get from the government in terms of energy support on energy prices, and the fact that we're working with our partners to secure and source the key raw material, which is the scrap within the UK, which you don't have to cart across the globe, gives us that opportunity to become more competitive from a cost perspective. And the fact that you're going to be working with a completely new technology which brings in efficiencies of production gives us that opportunity to make steel comparatively vis-a-vis the earlier blast furnace production.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pants. Did you want to come in on?
I did. Thank you very much. So my question is to Mr. McDiarmid. What do you think is needed for the company and the workforce to make the electric arc furnace project at Port Talbot a success? And what would be your comments on the transition thus far?
Well, there's perhaps more a question for Rajesh rather than myself, but clearly energy prices are the number one concern for all of us. The asks of the industry are the same now as they were 10 years ago, really, and energy prices are at the top of the list. In terms of how the transition is going, I think it's fair to say that we're not where we wanted to be. We don't believe the right strategy was followed for Port Talbot. We believe that ultimately the government and Tata went for the quickest and cheapest plan rather than the best plan, and we believe and our experts put together and a wide range of stakeholders from across the spectrum supported an alternative strategy for decarbonisation based on a gradual and phased transition which would have avoided any compulsory redundancies and kept open the door for other forms of steel-making technology to be introduced. It wasn't to be. We are where we are, and it is vital now that the business succeeds. We want to see this electric arc furnace built. And yeah, absolutely, energy prices is the top of the list. But I think, I know it's for Rajesh, I'm sure he'll come in next, but making sure that we have a robust scrap supply chain and we work out how we're going to keep more of this 80% within our borders and make sure it's the right quality and sorted in the right way and there's enough to go around. Because if everyone's transitioning to electric arc furnaces, there's going to be massive pressure on a supply chain that doesn't even exist yet.
Thank you, Mr. Nair.
While Alasdair has said what he has, I just want to make sure that the record is kept made straight. We have, through the part of the negotiation and part of the discussions with Syndex and all their consultants, made it very clear that running the blast furnaces in the way it was going to be run was not viable operationally, was completely unviable operationally, and we discovered that when we shut down the assets, because we are getting too close to end of life, which would have jeopardized the operations in general. And secondly, it was, as we heard earlier in a comment, it was financially completely unviable. And there was no government who, in its wise mind, would put money on a loss-making and use taxpayers' money to fund losses. So that was the clear approach we took, or the clear indication. And I think to the unions and to their consultants, it was made clear that the gap between what they were talking about and what we had shown, and I think it's all there in the discussions, the gap was too huge for any corporate to support, for any shareholder to support, and for any government to put money into losses. So just want to make the record straight over there. As far as the transition is concerned, you would have heard, we have offered the best support that has been done so far in any industry in terms of the people, unfortunately, who had to leave. We've done everything possible to make sure that the departure of these people who've been affected is as painless as possible, both from the point of view of the transition. We have acceded to several requests of delaying, the notice period, etc., just to give them sufficient time. The compensation and the support package has been the best ever. We have also put in training programs to enable people to bridge their skill gaps for future jobs to be open. We've offered a number of other support for the people. And I'm really pleased to say that the way people have left the business, I think couldn't have been better than what we had proposed. We have over 1,800 people who have left the business so far since we made the announcement, of which people who have left on compulsory is only about 160 people. So we've offered a huge amount of job matches across the South Wales sites where we have gone out of the way to make sure that people are given the right opportunities, and we've left it to them to take those opportunities. And I would like to say that people have gone with the best.
Just very briefly.
And I wanted to come back to Mr McDiarmid on that point, because what would the former steel workers say, and what would the unions say to the point that this has been very, very well managed, apparently?
Just briefly, Mr McDermott.
Well, we've probably got slightly different views on that, but I would recognise that we did negotiate together a very high-quality package of redundancy support, skills and training, and the union as well has invested heavily, along with the Welsh Government and the UK Government, in a support centre in the middle of Port Talbot, bringing together a range of employment agencies to support them to reskill and find new employment. And we've had more than 1,000 people come through our doors so far. So a lot of people have worked very hard to support the steelworkers that are coming out of the works, but it's difficult because they are extremely good, well-paid jobs that Port Talbot relies on. They're irreplaceable, really. And what we need longer term is more investment in that area. There's no question about that. We've got the Freeport coming in, but that's some years away. Those jobs which each of those jobs supports another 2 jobs in the local economy. They're irreplaceable, really, and it's devastating what's happened to Port Talbot and the surrounding community.
This committee's got to drop its advice for government in response to its steel consultation very shortly, and your session today has really helped us with our thinking on this. You've told us there's been deep disappointment with President Trump's tariffs. I haven't heard anybody calling for retaliatory tariffs against the United States, but a real concern that we align quickly our safeguards with Europe. You've told us energy costs are the number one problem. There's lots of steps that we need to take to keep scrap on shore. There have been some different views about the capabilities that we need in the industry here. £2.5 billion has been flagged as a good amount of money. What are the other things that you think that this committee should be saying to government in response to the steel consultation? Just give me your headline or two as the last question, Mr McDermott.
Well, I think as an overarching priority, speed is what we need. We've had consultation after consultation for many years over successive governments, and as I said before, the priorities for the industry are the same now as they were in 2015 when the Steel Council was first set up following the collapse of SSI. So we need action on procurement, we need action on trade, we need action on energy costs, we need support for low carbon investment, we need a CBAM, we need all of these things, and we needed them 10 years ago. So we just need to get on with it now before it becomes too late.
That's a really helpful, punchy answer. Mr Bell.
Thank you, Chair. I think Alasdair's beat me to it, unfortunately. So I think pace, absolutely. The Steel Council, government understand the challenges of the steel industry. We now need to start making progress with addressing those challenges.
Mr Bolton.
Yeah, I think ditto Alasdair says and Allan has said, speed, managing the transition carefully, because I understand we might want to invest in an ideal state going forward, but managing the next 12 months, if not 2 or 3 months, is critical. And I think I would strongly advise you try and influence the decisions around Scunthorpe to keep the 2 blast furnaces operating. And it's not just about the carbon costs, it's also about making sure that other assets in the UK potentially that are not belonging to the 2 businesses that are here today, that actually are utilised more efficiently and more effectively to support the business case.
Thank you. Finally, Mr Nair.
Very similar, Chair. But very simply put, I think it's important for the government to clearly set out a vision on what it wants to do with the industrial strategy, what businesses, what industries it wants to support, and follow it up with some real critical policy decisions and policies, and make sure that these policies are demonstrably long enough to make a difference.
How long is long?
I mean, at least for the next 10, 15 years, because it will take that much time for the investments to come in and investments to make, and make sure that this then drives inward investment into the industry that we so desperately need. I think that the investors need to see that UK is a place to bring investment in industry and manufacturing, and unless we do that, I think we're missing an opportunity.
Well, we don't always end on a note of consensus, but we have today. That's been extremely helpful. Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses. The committee is very grateful to you. That concludes this panel. Order. Second panel in today's inquiry, in our industrial policy inquiry, where we're looking at growth enhancing sectors. I'm delighted that our witnesses have been able to join us to give us a view on the defence industrial strategy. This session is important to the committee because it will help us draw up our submission to the defence industrial policy, which has been launched earlier in the year. So thank you so much indeed for our witnesses for joining us. Mr. Howie, I'm going to start with you, if I may. What do you think the conflict in Ukraine teaches us about the defence industrial strategy that this country now needs?
Chairman, I think that the key thing we learn from it is that it's first of all, it's a battle that nobody thought we'd fight. I think we all thought we'd finish seeing warfare in mainland Europe. And I think it's changed people's perceptions about the scale of war. I mean, the sheer volume of equipment that's being used. And I think when you then look at it, the two things I derive from it. One is about the need for capacity in the industry to support that volume of demand. And the second thing, the phrase I would use is freedom of action. The UK needs the ability to deploy equipment knowing that it's got access to a supply chain that isn't hindered by foreign governments or being third in the supply chain with two other customers.
Okay. What's the Airbus perspective, Oriel?
The key learnings, I think, for us, for Ukraine, is what it means for European defence and also for European defence cooperation. Those are the key things. I think the other key issue is the pace of innovation that is clearly required to respond to what's going on.
Okay. Chris Daniels, you're from a smaller organisation, but I mean, the kind of technology that you make has been widely deployed in Ukraine. What have the learnings been that you've taken?
So I would echo the innovation point, but I would drill down into that a bit further, that whatever technology is created the counter technology is created very quickly. So it's a constant race between technology and counter technology, and that race is happening kind of every few weeks, at most every 3 months. And I think in terms of an industrial strategy, what that means is we shouldn't be thinking of procuring equipment or stuff as a thing. We should be procuring a capability that can constantly iterate and change and move forward at a rapid pace, and a rapid pace at scale. And I think those are the key learnings that we're picking up is, you know, if we delivered our capability into Ukraine 2 years ago, it would have been defunct 18 months ago. And so you constantly have to upgrade what you're doing all the time. And I think that's a key part of strategy, to think that way.
And how does British Aerospace look at this?
Again, similar to John here, I think a resilient industrial base, I think, is absolutely demonstrated why we need capacity in our system. And obviously lots of focus on stockpiles, rightly so, but it's about kind of +1, day one on the stockpile. How quickly can we replenish, having that ability to replenish at pace? And again, similar to my SME colleague, I think what we've seen is the ability of the department to respond very quickly. I think we have learned that in a time of crisis, defence can respond, it can do it swiftly, and industry can respond. And I think it's now about how do we take those learnings into the industrial strategy going forward, into acquisition reform going forward, and really build on what I think industry has done and responded to over the last 3 years.
We win the conflicts that we imagine in the future without a defence industrial strategy that's stronger than it is today.
I think, again, it's important to have innovation in our system. I think, again, that ability to respond in a matter of days. Again, we're just talking about the unmanned part of the conflict. That ability to take learnings, bring them back home quickly, evolve and go again. So I think having, again, you've heard ministers talk about this always-on mentality. This ability to react and respond will put us in the best position to react to future conflict.
Can you win a conflict in the future without a good defence industrial strategy?
I'd argue no.
Okay, so what kind of capabilities do you think we now have to think about onshoring? The defence industrial strategy talks about a couple, talks about sovereign capabilities, talks about digital, talks about cyber, doesn't say much about chips, doesn't say much about a few other things. What have we learnt about the capabilities that we now need onshore?
Again, so I think it's about having a range. So obviously, naturally, at BAE Systems, we're lucky enough to be at the front end of building things like submarine ships and combat air capability. And it's about going to be having a balanced capability across the UK that supports everything from the large platform down to the small UAS, about the ability to respond to EW. And as you've rightly pointed out, within that, there's going to be a range of things. I mean, you could argue that battery technology, for example, that ability to source and build batteries could become a critical enabler in a future conflict. Again, we can't do it all. So there has to be a conversation with government, with industry partners, to identify where it is we want to have that resilience, where it is we want to hold that sovereignty.
Okay. Mr. Howie, where are the capabilities that we currently don't have that you think we're going to need to build in the future?
Well, that's, in a sense, a crystal ball question, isn't it? Because in some sense it depends on the nature of the conflicts we fight. And I know that one of the things the Strategic Defence Review has been doing is trying to sort of think about those various types of conflicts. What if it's a naval incursion from the high north, if it's a land battle? I guess the sort of threads, the one, again, going back to the learning from Ukraine, I think there is an argument that we need to improve our ability to be self-sufficient around munitions.
Munitions.
Yeah, a lot of our munitions capability we buy from suppliers who have got multiple government customers. Are we always first in the queue? As Adam said, we've always kept things like nuclear submarine production onshore. We haven't done quite the same with ships, so complex warships, yes, but auxiliaries we've allowed to be internationally procured. I think there's a debate about whether that's the right strategy going forward. I think it would be foolhardy not to be self-sufficient around autonomous systems, not just from the point of view of their use in battle, but as a critical technology that the UK should try and be in the forefront of. And then picking up on Adam's point, there's a whole range of what I might call enabling technologies, be it chip manufacture, battery systems, propulsion, that it's quite hard to be self-sufficient in some of the other capabilities without them.
In your supply chains, do you source chips from Taiwan, for example?
We're not sourcing chips directly, partly because a lot of our business is sustainment rather than direct production. But we do deal with suppliers who are predominantly buying chips from Taiwan. And one of the things we now know is that Taiwan, as part of its assurance mechanism, keeps the very high-end chip technology onshore. They don't invest that in the plants they build overseas, and you can understand why they do that, but it does mean that we have critical reliance on some of these nations. And I guess we all, from a supply chain point of view, we looked at what happened when that Evergreen ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and how quickly just-in-time supply chains started to falter. And so I know that the Department, Ministry of Defence, have looked very closely about how you reconfigure a supply chain at pace when your normal run-of-the-mill supplies just don't work, either because of a pandemic or an incident like that.
When you're looking across your supply chains, do you see dependencies that makes you kind of think, I'm not sure we're going to be able to sustain that in the future. I'm not sure it's wise to be dependent on that particular supplier in that particular place.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt, and the SME community suffered quite dramatically during the pandemic, trying to keep their businesses going, and we had to bail out a number of small companies who just would not have survived and couldn't have honoured the contract terms they'd signed up to because of that. So you have to deal with those things. I think the other thing we have to look at is those critical defence technologies that we need. We have to make sure that there is not just resilience in the suppliers who supply them, but in the supply chains that sit behind them. Yeah. And in some of those cases, we don't buy enough volume in the UK to make that supply chain robust. So nuclear submarines would be a good example. The nuclear submarine supply chain has always had fragility in it because we're not building 60 submarines like the US. And so I know the department are painfully aware of that, and there's been a lot of work done to make sure that they've mapped where those supply chain dependencies sit. But it's an ongoing debate.
Yeah. Oriel, Petry, what's your view from where you sit?
In terms of capability, I think there is considerable capability here in the UK, and for us the opportunity for the industrial strategy is for us to build on that considerable capability. I'm thinking particularly in our case about military satellite communications, which are heavily relied on by NATO allies, including the US, I hasten to add. That's at geostationary level, but we also have considerable capabilities at low Earth orbit level, and we've just got a contract with the Ministry of Defence for new satellites at LEO level for reconnaissance and intelligence. These are sectors, as my colleagues here have said, that need to be sustained, and for them to be sustained and for that industrial capability to thrive in the UK, air-to-air refuelling is another example, you do need to have a government that's supporting you to export it across the globe, because as John has said, it is really important that your market isn't limited to the procurement of your national government. So I would say the industrial strategy is a great opportunity for us to work together to identify the areas where we have real capability. Cyber is another one, and to make sure that it is fostered for the long term and built on and developed. The supply chain, we would say, does have certain vulnerabilities, linked for the same reasons. By the way, may I have a glass of water?
Yes, we can.
Our predecessors have...
Maynard will organise that for you immediately.
I think it's probably true for all of us. Sorry, forgive me. No. So you find your mouth goes a bit dry. Thank you. The supply chain has the same challenges, constrained also by the lack of it being a market that is sometimes beyond national, and then it has some specific challenges for us in our case, and I think it's probably true, that is, by the way, the same across our civil side. There's huge amount of similarity across the two, particularly around funding, digitalisation, skills and innovation.
Really helpful. Let me just flip back to the question at the top, which was, you talked about capabilities that we've got onshore that we need to strengthen, and that's absolutely one way to answer the question. But the question is actually, what are the capabilities that we're going to need to onshore that we don't necessarily have, for example, in your supply chain? When you're looking across your supply chains today, what are you thinking, that's going to need to come onshore in the future?
Yes, well, I think we would see it as a mixture. I don't think the solution can just be that you're onshoring. And so I think
I'm interested in what you think should be onshored.
Yeah. So I think as colleagues have said, the Strategic Defence Review will I think set out clearly what the capabilities are.
I hope so, but what's your view?
Exactly. Let me give you one example, which actually is an example around composites. The next generation of wings for our aircraft, which again are dual use, both for civil and for military, rely heavily on composites. And that's particularly because of the lightweighting. One of the things that we're extremely concerned about, Chair, and we're talking to the government about, is the lack of a supply chain in the UK for that composites work. So that's a very practical example that's going to hit us relatively quickly. And without, of course, the depth of the supply chain in the UK, that makes a prime like us also vulnerable.
Yeah, useful. And
I've got 3 points, I think. We've had this question answered recently with COVID. So, as an example, we couldn't, as a small company at that stage, we were maybe 10 people, we're now 35, we couldn't get enough chips and semiconductors, and particularly Raspberry Pis, which are these little hobbyist computers that we use as our brains in our drones. We couldn't get hold of enough of them, and even Raspberry Pis we could get hold of, but they were rationed. So we got everyone's parents and friends to order a Raspberry Pi, and I think that suggests that those chips and semiconductors and computer devices need to be onshored. And what we've seen from Ukraine is, as much as it's been a conflict of lots of things, it's been a conflict of resource, and the ability to actually get stuff into Ukraine has been problematic, whether it's artillery shells or drones or chips. And I think we need to think through how we do that. And I think in any conflict, history would suggest that our allies are not necessarily the same allies that we think we've got a couple of years before the conflict, who end up because diplomacy, as in the game, happens. I think the other point that isn't really brought up much is second and third order effects. So in World War II, when we ran out of metal, everyone turned up with their garden tools into buckets, and it all got melted down, and we kind of carried on. And I wonder if in the same scenario, we all turn up with mobile phones, old mobile phones, of which there are lots, and things with chips in, and we sort of recycle them. And I think a really interesting piece of work is how much kind of residual useful stuff is available that if there is a proper crisis, we would be able to get hold of. And somebody, some clever person probably can do that calculation at some point. And the third point I'd make is we've, in terms of our business, which is drones, which is going to be a crucial bit of any future conflict, we've not experimented with drones at scale. The MOD have procured a tiny number of drones in its history, probably in the hundreds, definitely not in the thousands, and we don't yet know what happens if we start trying to procure drones in the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands, and we haven't tested and stress tested those supply chains. And what is the thing that's missing? I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows.
Well, from chips to composite materials, that is quite a broad range of capabilities, but thank you very much indeed for setting the stage with that. Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. So the PM's given us our increase from 2.5% from 2027 to the end of the Parliament. Of that, 286 million is spent on equipment and supply, which I'll lump together as industry in a whole, and that's mapped out from 2023 to 2033. Quite a simple question would be to ask, is that enough? But what does that profile say? Does that allow you to do what you are asked to deliver, because the profile's already set out, and is there enough space there for you to innovate? Adam.
So obviously, again, we await anxiously the outcome of the STR to see where the government would like us to support them and invest. Obviously, we welcome the increase in defence spending. It's a positive sign of intent to obviously the UK's national security, but also the narrative around the role that industry is going to play in national security is certainly one which we welcome and support. Criticality for our industry is, as you say, long-term line of sight. So anything which gives us confidence into the future will allow us to invest in people, plant, machinery, and capability. Obviously, we need to wait and see what we're being asked to do and what we're being asked to support. But again, it's a sign of confidence.
Okay, John?
So I'm quite optimistic, actually. I mean, it sort of goes back to the chair's point about what lessons have we learned from Ukraine. One of the lessons I should have mentioned is we've learned that no one was willing to deploy what we might call the exquisite assets, the stuff that's too expensive for anyone to contemplate losing. And so it's driven a growth in more affordable, attritable type technologies. And so I look at things like our Type 31 frigate, £250 million each versus, Frem in France, probably more than twice that price. I think we'll see more money being spent on affordable technologies that we're willing to put in harm's way, and that probably means we'll get more value from the budget. I think the other thing, and again I would say this as a sort of sustainment partner to the three armed forces, I think there's a lot we can do to get better availability from the legacy equipment that's already in service. Because getting that fighting force to the front is a combination of the new equipment we deploy for new threats and making use of the equipment we've already got.
Trying to steer and connect you onto perhaps the chair's area then, there is some obvious implications for, with that profile, on our ability to ramp up and make things sovereign. Because we've already laid out 10 years. So perhaps from your perspective, Chris, smaller business and industry and the ability to scale up sovereign.
Yeah, so I don't see a percentage number of GDP as being the important factor, and people love to focus on numbers and targets.
Especially here.
It's absolutely. It's have we got the capability, and the capability isn't what have we got the capability now, it's have we got that capability, as you pointed out, to scale up rapidly in the future. And that's an element of kind of insurance policies. And if you think about the Nightingale hospitals in COVID, have we got, there's a SWAT team of people in the NHS who could create Nightingale hospitals in a month or whatever the time was. And I just wonder, what is the SWAT team in defence that can scale up? At the moment, our business could maybe produce 10 drones a month. I know we could produce 1,000 or 10,000 if we needed to, but nobody's stress testing us to do that or giving us the money to go and experiment and do that as a practice. And I think that's a really important part of the capability. In terms of
demand signal, are you receiving a demand signal? Has to be more than just a narrative. For the big primes, there might be enough comfort in there to invest. For smaller companies, yes or no?
No. So we're subject to the annualisation of budgets in the MOD. So last year we received about £4 million from the MOD in revenue to produce things. Next year, we don't know, and next year starts in a few weeks' time. I don't know whether it's 0 or 8 million or 10 million or 1 million. And from an investor perspective, that's a nightmare because they want to see revenues. And from our perspective, it's impossible to plan for the business, and we therefore always plan conservatively, don't hire enough people, because we're always on that edge of, well, what happens if the MOD suddenly decide we're not going to get anything? And it's the annualisation of budgets, which is a lack of strategy, is a real problem for SMEs. And we have done very well out of the MOD despite the MOD, not because of it.
Okay, coming on to, and we'll give you the opportunity to respond, Oriel, going small to big, the Airbus perspective. But there's a clear message there. There isn't adequate fidelity for the smaller firms about what the profile means and what the money needs, and there's almost no dissent about 286 billion not being enough. But there is clear, you were all quite clear earlier that there were things that you needed from broader government where money needs to be spent in other departments. And Oriel, the reason why I wanted to come back to you is in particular you spoke about digitalisation, skills. So for business and trade, skills and exports are fundamental, but we also need digital skills within the economy and STEM, in particular welding, which is in my industrial strategy submission, and MHCLG. So the question to you all then is, where does money need to be spent elsewhere in government to be able to get after delivering the outcomes that you need? Oriel first.
And maybe the answer is not where should it be spent elsewhere in government, but to look at where the commonalities lie. Now, clearly there is an exceptionalism about defence. Nobody is arguing with that. But when it comes to industrial growth and industrial capability, there are a lot of overlaps between the two. And I'm just thinking, in particular, in civil aerospace, we've had a very effective industrial strategy over the last 14 years. Successive governments have worked with industry. As part of that, we set up the Aerospace Technology Institute, 4 billion of joint funding on the industry and government side, has, for instance, financed a very strong wall in Bristol that can test not only for civil, but can also test for defence. Does defence ever test there? It doesn't, as an example. I think just to go back to your earlier question, I think one of the things about spend and spending it efficiently is how industry and government work together on innovation openly. And the challenge that we have, because defence is bought by the government, is sometimes that co-creation gets a bit complicated in a way that it's easier on civil because the market is the market. But I think there are lessons to be learnt there as well. And then particularly when we come to things like technology, so if we look at the work that we're doing with startups in our Stevenage site that does all the satellites, it's around things like quantum, around things like propulsion, in-orbit manufacturing, which again spans not just defence but goes beyond it. So I think you're quite right to identify these different digitalisations and innovation, but I think there's much to be gained for us to not just think of defence separate from other areas of advanced manufacturing, but integrated, and the supply chain. I mean, if you look at our supply chain, I don't know whether this is true for my colleagues, more than 50% of our supply chain is both defence and civil. So I think we do ourselves a disservice hiving off defence too much. Of course, there are things that you need to make perfect for defence, but there's a greater commonality that I don't think we collectively are leveraging as much as we might.
Concur. Social value.
Very briefly, Mr. Weston. Mr. Bailey, just very briefly.
Yep, sure. So social value within the tendering process is very important. How and where that money is spent. Have you got any examples of where, good examples? These have applied that, perhaps, John, and that maybe Adam.
I'll give you an example of, as part of our Type 31 frigate programme, part of our social value piece was encouraging people back into the workplace. So we ran a programme to hire people called production support operatives that specifically targets people that are not in education, employment or training. And we've so far brought in probably 200 people through that route, people who wanted a second career, young parents of young children who needed to get back in the workplace. And that's been transformative for the local community. And so we'll now run that at a national level.
Again, I mean, just to pick up on the partnership point, I think Team Barrow is a great example of where the whole of government can come together to support what is a national endeavour, so the submarine enterprise, which obviously outputs at Barrow, albeit with a UK-wide supply chain. We've seen successfully how multiple government departments can come together to ensure that the town of Barrow, can support submarine delivery for decades to come, Department for Education on skills, transport on access, the health system to ensure that there's a hospital there. So as the town grows, the population grows, that's going to require a whole of government response. So again, to echo Oriel's point, we can't see defence in isolation. It has to be a whole of government effort.
Very useful. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. Before I start, I would just like to refer you to my Register of Interests and my Directorship of Strategic Risk Control, which is the holding company for a company that operates in the operational technology cybersecurity space in the international defence markets. So moving on from that, starting with both Babcock and BAE, what barriers do you currently face in your ability to grow?
I suppose the most important thing around growth is certainty. It's understanding what we're growing into, and naturally we want that growth to be sustainable. So we've just talked about capacity, and off the back of Ukraine, obviously, there's lots of demand at the moment. So, and we are making investment. For example, we're growing our facilities in South Wales around munitions. We want that to be sustainable. In terms of demand, actually for us, we're oversubscribed on skills. People want to come and work in our sector. Again, this year has been the most successful. So in many ways, it's, there are barriers, of course, around things like energy. And again, as our facilities grow, we're going to have challenges around grid access. And I heard the previous panel talk about grid access. We can see some of those challenges down the line for us as we invest in infrastructure. But we are a growing sector, so we have been growing. I guess the limit of that will depend on where the government gets on defence spending in the long term, what its requirements are. But we believe we're ready to support that growth. In fact, we're continuing investing in our people, our plant, and our innovation.
Great, thank you. And Babcock?
Yeah, I would say predictability is key. Predictability gives industry the opportunity to invest because we need certainty. Access to skills, like BA, we're fortunate we get the skills we need by and large, but the defence sector does have a reputation issue. Much has been made of the ESG issues that are causing people to disinvest in defence.
Is that proving specifically what?
No, go on. This is an important point.
Specific about the types of skills, because obviously defence covers a range of skill sets.
So probably the areas, and one of the members mentioned it earlier, things like welders. There is a national shortage. Shipbuilding in the UK predominantly relied on Eastern European transient labour, which we now can't bring to the UK. Which I think BAE and we are both investing heavily in training, but that takes time. The flash to bang time is measured in years. So those skills, particularly technician type skills, lots of investment in apprentices and graduates, but again, it takes time to build experience. The other thing where support would be really, really helpful is a sort of a joined-up government approach to export support. It's an area where the UK, I think, lags behind countries like France, Italy and the US. Not because there isn't enthusiasm for exports, but we don't hunt as a pack internationally.
What are the specifics that those other countries do that we should be doing? So I know we'll have to keep it brief, but...
You do government-level deals that are broader than just the defence product. So we tried to sell frigates into Greece. The order went to France because France offered to support Greece in the event of a conflict with Turkey. So the French president went straight. So they operate as and they own quite a bit of the industry, so that makes it easier. But they hunt as a pack abroad, and it's without ministerial level support for some of these big export deals as a challenge. That's an area where actually relatively little money would make a huge difference.
Thank you.
Kevin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the panellists. You may know I'm representing the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee today, and thank you, Chair, for that inclusion. We have conducted an inquiry on defence spend in Northern Ireland. Babcock and BAE will recognise back in 2017 the National Shipbuilding Strategy was to follow a modular path to try and spread the industrial capacity across the United Kingdom. The Statement of Intent that was published in December had prosperity as their fifth target, and that was about the spread of high-end jobs throughout the United Kingdom. Do you as companies, start just to Adam and then I've got some questions for Oriel if that's okay, but we'll go along. Do you as companies feel an onus or a burden or the ability to answer the clarion call of government when they say we'd like to see you spread investment across the United Kingdom?
By our very nature, we're geographically diverse already. I know lots of focus on the southeast in lots of sectors. I think we're quite proud of our sort of heritage in the northwest, in South Wales and Scotland. I think you rightfully identify we probably don't do as much in Northern Ireland as others. But for us, it's about we've got historic roots in many parts of the country. But equally, our supply chain is all over the UK. We've got 6,000 suppliers. We spend 4 billion a year in our supply chain. And we will go to the market and we will find suppliers which offer us the capability, the equipment and the skills that we need. So we absolutely recognise the importance of spreading prosperity, of social mobility and everything else.
1/5 of the UK average in Northern Ireland for defence spend, just to encourage you, John.
Yeah, and I guess like BAE, we don't do a lot in Northern Ireland, but again, we think it's an opportunity, not a risk. And I think the aircraft carrier programme was a great example of using shipyards around the UK to bolster the national capability, and we should do more of that. I think there's real opportunities to do there. We spend about £1 billion a year in our supply chain, but actually we've got about over 1,000 suppliers in what would be classed as economically deprived areas, and we've got 3,800 SMEs in our supply chain. So a lot of that money already goes into areas that are economically disadvantaged. But I do think defence is a great area to use for economic stimulus in areas where there's lower sort of economic and social mobility.
Thanks, Shaun. Oriel, do you roll your eyes whenever government put out these grand plans that don't align with your corporate ambition? Or do you seize them, invest in the regions of the UK?
As a former civil servant.
But she's free to speak now, Chair.
Well, as a civil servant, it's a very easy answer. No, we don't roll our eyes at all. I mean, I think I would pick up Adam's point around historic roots. Because as we've been exploring with you here, the skills, the knowledge that we rely on as defence and advanced manufacturing businesses are built over long periods. John, I think you were talking about welders, our cyber people in Wales, 7 years to train them up to be who they need to be. Northern Ireland, as you know, has some really strong capabilities. And while the arrangement that we are working through with our competitor on Spirit in Northern Ireland was something we would have preferred to keep Spirit as a supplier, we are excited, I can tell you, to have Northern Ireland added to the portfolio of what we do in the UK.
Thank you. So you've mentioned already composites, very important, but we led the way in Belfast, and that's the A220, and you're buying the wings facility. Sorry, you're being paid $559 million to take the wings facility. What's taking so long?
Thank you. The 559 million is not just for Belfast, as you know. It's the overall Spirit deal. That is something that's arbitrated by the market, not by us. We are very excited to be taking over the wing factory in Northern Ireland and very glad to have that skill set join the skill set that we're doing. I think composites, clearly what you do there is quite magic, and I think adding that to what we do in North Wales is a positive.
When do you think it'll be concluded?
So, I mean, I'm not in the deal team. I understand it is nearing completion.
And then so to move away from my frustration about this process, can I ask you about your frustration? So take one example recently, the medium-lift helicopter procurement opportunity from MOD. It has a civilian side to it, it has a defence side, it's clearly defence procurement opportunity. The tender goes out, they set criteria, they end up taking bids from the one company that can't satisfy the criteria. I mean, how does that sort of interaction assist with building a resilience and a confidence within the private sector when you're trying to assist government with their aims?
So the new medium helicopter, Chair, was the request for a large military helicopter, and we put together what we thought was a very exciting bid that was going to have a new production line in our North Wales factory with a number of suppliers, including Spirit in Belfast. So we took on the challenge of the social value propositions and everything that you've been talking about. It was very much focused on new jobs. It was a new advanced manufacturing line, as I say, in North Wales, crucially because we believed that the UK could be the home base for, we estimated, in excess of 5 billion of exports. And I suppose the slight frustration for us, having built this campaign with tremendous support, many thanks, from parliamentarians, when we then looked in detail at the way in which the procurement was run, we found that actually we were surprised that the weighting for those social value aspects of the campaign were not as we expected them to be. And that's then led to us to have to conclude.
Do we not need to think differently now about social value? If we're trying to onshore capability with a new vigour, if we're trying to make sure that that capability is well spread strategically around the country, don't we need to think differently about social value in the future? Isn't it now strategic value?
Well, Chair, I would say I think we've got the foundations for what to us as a business looks like pretty sound criteria of jobs, growth, long-term capability, sovereign capability. So I think we have the ingredients. I think from our point of view, what we would like to see is the ingredients that, by the way, are in the statement of intent that the Ministry of Defence has put out very clearly, or the Prime Minister saying UK jobs, UK innovation, UK growth. But I think what we would like to see as businesses is that pulled through. I think the implementation is the key. And again, now is the moment through this industrial strategy to really focus on that implementation, I would suggest.
Okay, Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. And I think just picking up on that point around procurement and I think where we want that to go, what direction that might take. The committee visited Scotland yesterday to look at our defence industry partners, including we had a fantastic visit to BAE and some of the supply chain as well. So I wondered if you could comment on how you think the procurement by the MOD might need to change. Some of the things you've already mentioned included annualisation of budgets being a challenge. Perhaps there needs to be innovation embedded. And we heard from BAE yesterday about a profile of commitment that could help to get things on the right keel. One of the things that we heard about was the Defence and Security Accelerator as being one programme that the MOD does that works quite well, actually. There could be some tweaks, but because that creates revenue and that helps investors to see that potential. So I wondered if from your experience as both knowing your supply chain and yourselves, you could comment on perhaps those two elements. Start whenever you like.
I'll go first if you want. I guess the plea we would make most, and this is a conversation we have with the MOD all the time, and you and Andy Starr, as the interim National Armaments Director, absolutely understands this. Defence procurement, the biggest challenge in it is, for want of a better phrase, the red tape phase. The flash to bang time from setting a requirement to actually placing a contract is probably twice as long as it needs to be on average. There's a lot of time taken up, but the other thing it does is it restricts the supply chain, because the cost of bidding becomes really high, and that's fine if you're a national champion with a big balance sheet. If you're an SME or a mid-cap company, it's a bit more of a challenge. And so one of the things I know that the D&S reforms were aimed to do, and we'll see how it plays out, is to try and get some additional pace into the system. So take out cost, take out red tape, so that the military capability is delivered faster, and that it makes it easier for SMEs to play as part of that supply chain.
I think it's, just to build on this, it's about having the right procurement model for the right capability, ultimately. Yeah. And again, I think I referred earlier to, we've all talked about the Ukraine response. The department has responded admirably, rapidly. We've been the recipient of some rapid turnaround on perhaps some more disposable capabilities, but also some more substantive capabilities. The DNS obviously donated AS90, and they acquired the Archer from Sweden in less than 6 months. So it can be done. But equally, we've talked about nuclear submarines here today. That is not something you're going to be acquiring on a sort of a rapid turnaround. So it's about having the agility, it's about having the right model, but obviously industry then understanding that approach. And again, I think people have talked about having that dialogue. So understanding what the customer need is, engaging with industry early, and then working to satisfy it as quickly as possible. But again, reforms are underway, and hopefully they will lead to some of that agility, which I think we would all welcome.
Can I respond? We've been recipients of 3 DASA grants, and that's been super helpful to get us going. The challenge is there isn't a process to go from that early stage innovation to the next stage, to the next stage, to the next stage. And it should almost, if DASA was working, not DASA, if the system was working properly, it would be by exception that DASA doesn't lead to a frontline kind of large procurement contract. But if you look at the statistics, it's probably less than 1% of DASA funded things end up in the front line. And the problem with that is it's sort of like crack cocaine for startups, in that it gets you started, but then there isn't an easy way of following up on that. And can I also respond on the location point as well, that when 6 years ago we were 2 people in the company, I came in as a third, and we had one person working abroad, and the CEO was half in Newtown in Wales and half in Edinburgh. We could have located anywhere. Because the defence market is so inefficient, you have to be where all the defence procurement and MOD people are, which is basically London, possibly Bristol, kind of Filton Abbey Wood area. And that was our decision, that we have to be within an hour of that in order to be in the face of the market, which goes, and we could have stayed in Edinburgh and we could have moved to Northern Ireland, we could have moved anywhere, but we almost couldn't, because you cannot grow a business without doing that. And you cannot, as a startup, I mean, we're now an SME or a scale-up, but as a startup, you can't afford the travel costs to keep going to these kind of MOD industry days and kind of information days that you have to go to in order to get the next level of business.
Thank you. Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Adam, how do you think the procurement process takes stock of our changing relationship with the US?
I suspect, like many people, they're constantly taking stock of sort of geopolitical events, but it stands that the US is a long-standing ally and partner of the United Kingdom. I think many of the capabilities we've talked around today involve partnership with the United States. Similarly, we have other partnerships into Europe, and by our very nature, we are collaborators as a nation. Our combat air sector, for example, Typhoon, F-35, Tornado are all collaborative efforts. So I know we've talked lots today about sovereignty and onshoring, but the nature of our sector is that we ultimately collaborate. So I think for us, the US is important for our business. It's important for the United Kingdom. And similarly, we're seeing other evolving partnerships through AUKUS and GCAP. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of the broad array of partnerships that we have.
Oriel, on that point then, do you think that ultimately we will need to get to a position of sovereign resilience to not be reliant on the large players like the US? Or do you not see that as a world where we're coming towards?
The US, as it is for BAE, remains a really important market. We have 2 final assembly lines there, 5,500 people. So the US remains really critical. I think I would go back to some of the things I was saying earlier around UK capability. So I mentioned the contract that we've just won with the Ministry of Defence for a low Earth orbit intelligence and reconnaissance satellite. We already know that Norway and Germany is interested in that. And we are seeing, particularly also in our very sovereign cyber capability, there are new conversations opening up with some of our Five Eyes colleagues. I mean, that's technology actually that you wouldn't want to export beyond very close allies. So I think there are opportunities that the UK just needs to be alive and agile to, that other countries may look to procure and look to the UK for certain capabilities in a way that they might not have before. But from our point of view, as for Adam, the US remains a really key partner.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We're touching on exports there. Obviously, defence exports are huge. The numbers are absolutely astonishing, and that's likely to continue that upward trend. If I might come to you first, Oriel, given your involvement with UK trade and investment in Paris, you talked about co-creation with government, sometimes the difficulties that can create. What do you think that the government can better do to support defence exports? And allied to that, a question about where should it sit within government. And again, you're a former civil servant. Should it sit with the MOD, who also got the expertise in this field, or should it sit with the Department of Business and Trade, do you think?
So I don't really have a view on where it should sit. I suppose my view is, going back to the earlier conversation, that government needs to work hand in glove. And I think, as John and Adam mentioned before, I do think, as Airbus, there is opportunity for that export support, particularly in defence and for defence equipment, to be more lined up, more aligned, and have a government-to-government wrapper. This is one of the big differentiators for the UK compared to some of our main competitors. France actually is quite a good example, but there are others. Where
just give us a quick list of the others. Who else is
of the other countries? So
yeah.
France, the US is a classic example.
Yep.
They're probably the two main, but there are other Italy, other countries do it a little bit. And where we fall short is some of the I would call it the wiring that sits underneath it. So there is, with a G2G, often a prepayment, which is the sort of rubber stamp that a government gives, and we have not in our system succeeded to do this, despite a lot of work. So from my point of view, and I don't know whether my colleagues would agree, one of the great things that we could get out of this process of the industrial strategy is to really focus on that export, because that is the key to the sustainability of the sovereignty. If you're not just reliant on one nation, but you're reliant on a whole host of allied nations to buy your kit. And then just to go back to my dual use point, one of the reasons why a business like ours is doing dual use is that you manage your long lines of defence with, the civil side of it, and exports could have that same sort of function while you're waiting for the next review to come up for the UK to buy the next piece. You're selling across the globe, and then I would just add, from as you've referenced my background, the importance for the national bilateral relationship of having that tie between nations is also extremely important, I think. So I would like to see industry used more as a way of fostering bilateral diplomatic relations.
If I come to you, a smaller company, is exporting on your radar? Is that something you want to do? Is it too daunting?
No, we've done business with the US Department of Defence. We've had 3 different contracts, small contracts with them. They work very differently in that they have technology scouts, effectively liaison officers, who guide you through the process and make it very easy for you, which the UK doesn't have, which I would thoroughly recommend that, to have somebody that is just a single point of contact.
That's quite remarkable. So the Americans approached you and helped you supply them.
I have a single point of contact who is the European Technology Scout for the US DoD, and his job is to do all the 100, 200 conversations with different people in the US Department of Defence to put our product in the right kind of eyes and ears, whereas in the UK I have to do that myself, which comes back to my point about inefficient process. And that's why it's an easy place to do business. And from an SME perspective, the order of export is you start with your home country, you then go to the US because its defence budget is bigger than everyone else you're ever going to do business with combined. You then go to the sort of next easiest, which is probably the Middle East, once you've got the rubber stamp of UK, US. And currently, the area of interest for us is what we'd call the JEF nations, which are the Nordics and the Baltic states and Poland, because although their defence budgets aren't huge, their discretionary budget and their budgets for technology are disproportionately large, and they're putting a lot more of their GDP into defence.
Your experience is good, but just not here. Sorry, Adam.
No, I was just going to add, exports is exceptionally important to us as a business, as a sector, and again to the communities of which I've referred to. I think first and foremost, having something to export is exceptionally important. So we export around 4 billion a year from the United Kingdom. As you said, it's not an insignificant number. And you can draw a golden thread back from an export out of this country back to an apprentice in the UK. So it underpins everything we're doing. Typhoon is a great example. I think we invested 10, 12 billion up front at the beginning of the programme, and it's returned nearly 30 billion to the United Kingdom. So the significance not only to sustaining the capability that we started this session with around being able to respond to global uncertainty, the importance of doing that. So I think having things, considering exports at the beginning of a procurement process is something which is regularly talked about, and I think we've got plenty of examples to show where that is important.
Shaun, I mean, the global combat ship that you're putting together in Babcock and Rosyth, that obviously you've got one eye on the export market with that. What can the UK government do to help get that sailing the seven seas?
Well, I think Type 31 is a good example of a product that was deliberately bought to be exportable. And I'll just echo Adam's point, because it sort of takes us back to the whole piece about sovereign capability. We can't export something if the intellectual property doesn't reside in the UK. So one of the decisions government has to make when we choose to buy from an international supplier, the chances are the intellectual property resides in their home market, and so that's where exports happen from. So there's an unbreakable link between domestic procurement and export capability. Type 31 is exportable because the design rights reside in the UK, the shipyard capabilities in the UK. Same for Global Combat Ship on the Clyde. Government have been really supportive. We wouldn't have won in Indonesia and Poland without them. But if I go back to my earlier point, I think it's an area where, both DBT and MOD recognise this, that the UK, if you pardon the phrase, we need as a country to up our game and compete with people who don't always play by the same rules that we do.
Thank you,
Chair. This is the whole panel, and you talked about exports, and you talked about scale-ups, SMEs. What tangible outcomes would you like to see from the defence industrial strategy by the end of Parliament? What do you see was be successful? And I'll start with Chris, if that's okay, because I'm an SME fan. I was hoping to go last, so I had time to think through that question. What we would like to see is, so first of all, a single innovation. If I take, starting point is innovation. So a single innovation hub. At the moment, there's about 10 within the MOD, and then that links directly to the next stage, which is proof of concept testing, which then links directly to the next stage, which is buying at small scale, which then links directly to the next stage, which is buying at scale, and having a very clear process that right from the offset that this is how it all works, with, coming back to the point, a single liaison person who helps you and guides you through that process. I would like to see a very clear amount of money for certain capabilities put aside that's multi-year, that means that you've actually got some visibility, and then you can raise investment, you can raise equity off the back of that. And I'll probably stop there. I'll give you a list of about 100 Christmas presents I'd like.
Well, look, do feel free to write to the committee with that.
Yes.
Because actually we've got to come up with some advice on how government should judge the success of its defence industrial strategy. So that would be very useful. Oriel.
I think the best, at the end of this Parliament, you were saying, I think the best outcome would be to have policies that are coming out of the government that reflect the industrial reality. And by that I mean that there is not the artificial divide, or at least not such a tight artificial divide between defence and wider advanced manufacturing. And I think the government has got some ideas on this. So going back to the funding challenges for the smaller businesses, I think it's welcome that National Wealth Fund is now looking at defence. I think the work for the British Business Bank to look at smaller companies and funding is also welcome. And that should be not just for defence or other businesses, it needs to be across the piece. And then I'd like to also see, particularly in technology, much greater policy that really merges the two between defence and, you all know this, between defence and non-defence technology, because I think that's where quite a lot of innovation will sit. And then I think from my point of view, can I remember my third? I'm going to stop there because it's just gone out of my head. Thank you.
Once again, any advice you want to supply to us after? Really welcome. John?
I think I would just say two things. I think in an ideal world, we get real guidance on the capabilities the UK wishes to see as sovereign, that industry can then invest in with some certainty. I think the other thing, and that this is about the difference between policy and process, I think the UK operates probably the most open defence procurement market in the world, which is often not reciprocated by other nations that we give access to. But it's understanding the difference when we run open competition to get the lowest price or the fastest delivery, and when, going back to the social value piece, we use other criteria to make sure that we retain that capability in the UK and invest in it where we need to, because that won't always be the cheapest or the short-term best solution, but it might ultimately be the one that delivers the best gross value add to the economy in the longer term.
I feel like many have been taken. I think we talked a lot today about certainty and stability, and I know that's a key theme of the industrial strategy. So I think something that sets out a clear roadmap for the UK's direction of travel, where it wants to invest and sustain a sovereign capability of which then industry can invest behind, invest in people. With that long-term certainty we talked about, it takes many years to generate skills and capability in this country. So that's really crucial for us. I think something around the importance of partnership. Again, we can't do what we do without a close partnership with government, not just defence. We've talked about other government departments here today, but also Parliament. So I think something that sets out how we're going to go forward in a very clear, close and open collaborative nature with the MOD. And I think something for the wider population. I mean, we've talked a lot about today about, and we welcome again Secretary of State's comments about bringing defence up, bringing it out there and demonstrating it as a growth driving sector. I think that's going to be beholden on everybody, and documents such as the Industrial Strategy, the Defence Review and the National Security Strategy are going to really have to think about how we take the population at large with us on this journey as we grow our industry.
Finally, Gregor Poynton.
Great. Oriel, you mentioned the National Wealth Fund. The Scottish National Investment Bank, the mandate currently essentially from the Scottish Government doesn't allow them to invest in defence industry in Scotland. Do you think that should change? And if it did, would that help grow the Scottish defence industry?
I do think that the fact that the National Wealth Fund has now this explicit inclusion of defence is positive for all the reasons that we've discussed here. Sovereignty clearly is key, technology is key, and I think, as I was saying before, not an arbitrary division between defence and non-defence is positive. I imagine it will be similar in Scotland as it is in the UK.
Yeah, so change the mandate, grow the industry in the same way.
I mean, yes.
Yeah. Perhaps given the footprint you have in Scotland, John and Adam.
Yeah, no-brainer, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Access to investment is always welcome.
Yeah.
Again, the broader recognition of the contribution that defence makes.
Okay. That's been incredibly useful. Thank you very much indeed. That's really helped the committee with its thinking on the submission that we supply back to government in response to its consultation on defence industrial strategy. Very briefly, Mr Bailey.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that my register of members' interest is on record, and I'm working with Airbus on the space strategy, have flown their aircraft, and I've also been working with Babcock for our submission for the industrial strategy on skills, and I have the same tie as Chris. So.
Thank you. It's on the record. Thank you very much. That concludes this panel. Welcome to this third panel in today's inquiry session on industrial policy in the UK. We're absolutely delighted, Mr. Grady, that you've been able to join us together with Tom from AstraZeneca to help us in our thinking and then our understanding of industrial policy, in particular in the life science sector. Mr. Grady, let me just sort of kick off. Why did AstraZeneca ultimately decide not to invest in Speak?
Yeah, so thank you for the welcome, Mr. Chair. We're very pleased to be here. So if I can just remind everybody, Speak was our intent and proposal to expand our manufacturing site in South Liverpool for the manufacture of a new vaccine, but also creating an end-to-end pandemic capability in Liverpool, which was obviously very welcome to us and very welcome to the government. What we agreed to in principle was a risk share arrangement with the government, whereby the capital and R&D costs of the Speak project were £450 million, and the government indicated a willingness to contribute £90 million towards that overall cost. And of course that was announced in March of 2024 as part of the budget. And then, as everybody knows, the general election was called, there was a pause, things went on hold, and then we recommenced due diligence and detailed analysis of the project with the new government over the summer. We had made very clear to the government that we needed confirmation of the availability of the grant and the amount by August, because that was our deadline to commence the R&D.
It's August 2024.
That's correct. Yeah, we were doing the research and development in parallel with the planned construction of the building. And of course, influenza is a seasonal vaccine, and because that confirmation wasn't forthcoming, we missed the season. The business case, which, to be honest, had been quite marginal in the first place, the business case was significantly undermined because our launch dates were put back. So when the offer emerged, I think in October, of support to the tune of £75 million, that didn't then support the revised business case with the new timelines sufficiently. So regrettably and unfortunately, we communicated to the government that we would not be proceeding with the project.
So the government basically fell about 15 million short of what had been proposed by, I guess, Jeremy Hunt. And for a lack of 15 million, lost out on a 450 million investment.
Well, that's not entirely accurate, because the amount that ultimately emerged was 15 million less than the Jeremy Hunt offer. Yeah. But because of the delay and because we'd missed the R&D programme and the season, we're not really comparing like with like. It was a very different, diminished business case as a result of the launch timelines being pushed out.
It was partly an issue of speed and partly an issue of money?
It was mostly an issue of speed. I mean, had we received the confirmation of the grant in time, and it would have been of the lower amount, it would have been it would have had a different discussion. But in the event, because it wasn't forthcoming until October, the justification for the business case was no longer viable. Even a company of the size and scale of AstraZeneca has limitations and restrictions around the amount of capital expenditure that we can make. And in many respects, these projects are all competing with each other, because there's lots of things we could be doing in different therapy and disease areas around the world. And as I've said, the Speak project was fairly marginal at the outset, but we were very keen to push ahead. And then the delay, unfortunately, led to us making the regrettable decision that we wouldn't proceed.
The 40 million was on the table in August 2024. That was upped to, you said 75 million. I had 78 million, but it was sort of mid 70 million.
Million was the first offer. We've seen reference to 78 million in the media, but from our perspective, 75 million is the accurate number.
There was only a 2-month delay in that offer going up, but that 2-month delay was sufficiently damaging for AstraZeneca's point of view to scupper the whole thing?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. I mean, there's a programme and a timing for the trials. It was all very tightly programmed. We were ready to go at the beginning of August, had the confirmation been received, and that 2 months did have a very significant impact.
Did you think that civil servants and ministers knew that that would be the impact of a delayed decision?
We had made it very clear, both in correspondence and in discussions between AstraZeneca colleagues and officials, of the importance of that date. I'm not sure I would put myself in the shoes of the officials as to what might happen if that date...
But you must have often asked yourself, what is going on here? Surely these guys know that there's a 2-month delay that's going to imperil the whole project. You must have been tearing your hair out.
Yeah, we don't have any regrets that we repeatedly made it clear the critical importance of that August deadline.
Do you have a gut feel for what was going on the other side of the fence?
I mean, it was very clear to us that the officials were working very hard and actually did try very hard to do their work and do their work quickly. It took time, as one would expect with these forensic due diligence exercises. It was very detailed. And yeah, despite our constant reminder that August really was a key date, the confirmation didn't come until the October timeframe.
Did you get the sense of where it got snagged? Was it in the Department for Business and Trade or in the Treasury or somewhere else?
I don't think we had a clear read on that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Weston.
Thank you for that. So you said there was a seasonality about this vaccine. What was the vaccine? And have we missed the season? Obviously, I assume it was a recent season, given the time pressure. When will that season return?
Yeah, so it's an influenza vaccine, and the project was to convert the manufacturing activity from an egg-based to a cell-based approach. So entirely connected to the flu season, and having missed that particular season, it wasn't really a case of just pushing it back until the next season, because the underlying economics in the business case were significantly affected. So we will not now proceed with the project in Speak, and we're looking at other ways to bring the cell-based manufacturing vaccine to the market, potentially in partnership with other industrial players.
Okay. That particular process that you're describing, you're saying it may be relevant to future seasons, but for whatever reason you just think that it's no longer relevant to Speak.
That's correct. Yeah, we put this risk share arrangement together. We were taking quite a bit of risk doing the R&D in parallel with the construction of the site. We were very pleased to receive the offer of the support from the government, but when we missed the R&D program, the number came down. The investment in Speak for that new facility was no longer viable.
The R&D program's continued?
No, it hasn't. No. It's on hold, and we are investigating alternative options in exploratory early discussions with other industrial partners.
Okay. Why did you think of Speak in the first instance? What was the opportunity presented by Speak?
So Speak is our current influenza manufacturing site in Garston in South Liverpool. So we have 400 vaccine manufacturing skilled employees.
You could have gone to a vaccine site in Europe, but you chose... Or you don't have any vaccine sites in Europe?
We don't have vaccine sites in Europe. Speak Liverpool is our vaccine manufacturing site. We had space at Speak, but when we couldn't make the numbers work, when we couldn't make the finances work, we've put that project on hold. We won't go forward in Speak, and we're investigating other alternatives for cell-based manufacture.
Okay. So you had existing workforce there. It was just building or supplying into an existing facility, not necessarily additional employment. Or
no, there would have been additional employment. We had the existing leadership team at the vaccine plant. We could have obviously redeployed people on the site, but there would have been additional employment as a result. I don't actually have the figure at my fingertips, but we can send that.
Do you think the government fully appreciated the opportunity and the value that this investment would have brought in terms of the socioeconomic?
I do believe they've fully understood
and
it.
UK.
We provided an enormous amount of information and data and explanation, and that was all available to the government. And of course, an offer of a grant was forthcoming at the end of the day, but unfortunately, it came a little too late for this project at the lower amount.
Quite striking, the monies you're talking about in terms of shortfall, given that a school in my constituency has gone massively over budget by a not dissimilar sum of money. Anyway, Chair.
Thank you very much. I just want to double check the government's initial contribution of 90. That's within the 450, is it, or on top?
Yeah, 450 of which the government contributed.
So it's an 80-20 split, basically.
20%.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Joshua Reynolds.
Thanks, Chair. Can you just confirm for me, when did you make and confirm with the government the final decision to not go ahead with the investments?
In January.
It was January. Yeah. So, because you mentioned August and October.
Yeah, August was the deadline. We had requested to have the confirmation so the R&D programme could continue on time and not affect the business case. The award was confirmed to us in October, and we met, Tom and I and senior colleagues met officials in Whitehall in January, where we shared the unfortunate information that we would not be proceeding.
Okay. At the ministerial urgent question, the minister at the time had said that it was disappointing following intensive work and collaboration between government and the company. Would you agree that it was intensive collaboration?
Yes, I would.
You would. And they obviously then decided at that point that there was then that piece where the significant change meant they couldn't move ahead. So what work would you say was done by the previous government, and what work would you say was done by the current government?
Yeah, so the previous government commenced its due diligence work, so work had started. Obviously it was preliminary because they were just sort of getting into the detail, and then the election was called, things went on pause, and then the work was sort of resurrected following the election.
Okay. And you mentioned obviously government departments that you were speaking to and you were having these conversations with. How were the relationships within those departments? Obviously, if you said that your deadline was August and that didn't get met, I'm imagining the relationships couldn't have been the most positive.
No, I think the relationships were very professional. And
why was the decision so late then? Past if the relationships were really professional, well, they knew your deadline, but they still missed it by a really significant amount.
The interactions between the officials and AstraZeneca employees were professional and respectful. Clearly there was growing frustration as we got closer and closer to the deadline, and ultimately it was missed.
And where would you say the final problem, that blocker in effect, sat with? Was it a minister? Was it the government? Was it civil servants? Where was the problem?
So my personal view is I think it was a combination of events. That the announcement was made, and then pretty shortly thereafter the election was called. We lost a lot of time. It so happened that was on a project that really had this time critical sensitivity, which we reminded the officials of repeatedly. That was not met. It's very frustrating and it's very disappointing, but it's business, and we have lots of discussions with lots of governments around the world, and it doesn't always come to fruition. But it was a very clear business decision based on the financial metrics of the particular project.
And just finally for me then, what does this fall through, this investment falling through, what impact does that make on your decisions to make future investments in the UK?
So again, I'd repeat that the Speak decision was on its merits around the business case in Speak, but for AstraZeneca and companies like AstraZeneca, the business environment more broadly is a really important factor in making those decisions. When we look at life science clusters and countries where we might invest, we tend to look through three pillars. First is presence of strong science and R&D investment, and in the UK we really punch above our weight in that respect with world-leading universities and research institutions. The second tenet is there being a business environment that's conducive to making investments and recruiting talent. And then the third lens and pillar is the appetite and the willingness of a particular country to actually adopt the innovation that will emerge from that research and development and manufacturing. And that's the area where currently we feel the UK is falling down.
We're going to come back to this very, very important point. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to sort of come back to part of the timeline that we were just trying to sort of construct with you a few moments ago. So when you first had the offer under the previous government, how did you hear about that? Because we've had reports that the Chancellor of the Exchequer notified the company through WhatsApp. Is that true?
We read about that too in the media, that everything was done by WhatsApp. From our perspective, it was a conventional, normal interaction by emails, teleconferences being set up and what have you.
Did you receive the first notification of an offer, so for the £90 million, through a text message or through an official email?
So I cannot speak to what WhatsApp messages may or may not have been sent, but from our perspective, this was a normal interaction, a very normal business-like interaction, rather than, as it was reported, this was all done, rather haphazardly by WhatsApp. That's not what happened.
And when did you get that first confirmation of the initial idea that it would be £90 million?
It would have been shortly before the announcement was made.
It was very close to the election. But I think what I was just trying to understand was how much due diligence they might have done that those civil servants working on it would then have known about this August deadline that was so critical to the project. So I'm just interested in at what point they said, yes, we're going to give you that, versus looking at that option. So was it just a matter of days before the election, or?
No, so the in-principle offer was made before any due diligence was carried out. And when we made agreement to that risk share partnership, then the more detailed due diligence started, and pretty shortly after that, the general election was called.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie Maynard.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. So the 450 million, very roughly, what was that going to be spent on? Headline.
So that was a combination of R&D and capital. So the ultimate final amount was actually the total project costs were 590 million.
Okay.
390 million was for the capital construction of the facility, and 90 million was for UK conducted in the United Kingdom.
Sorry, was what?
For research and development.
R&D. Okay. So 390 million construction, and that includes capex as well. It's not just the construction of yeah, right. Okay. So what I am confused by is the flu vaccination season starts in October, November. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting 450 million or 590 million in August. You're saying 390 million spent on construction, including building and fitting out a plant, and you're saying, and then also some R&D out there, but then you're saying this was all about the flu season that was kicking off in October, November. I mean, you obviously can't spend that sort of money in that sort of time period, so it's really weird to be talking about that season as being completely critical, and that just doesn't make sense. Can you explain?
It was carrying out the research and development from August that would have our launch preparedness for subsequent flu season.
Okay, fine. So park the R&D, but the 390, which is construction and fitting out a facility, that takes many, many months.
Yeah, so the 450 million wouldn't have been paid in August. What we were looking for in August was confirmation that the grant would be forthcoming and the amount of the grant. And because that didn't happen, we were unable to initiate the research and development.
Mr. Grady, I mean, the way that it's been said so far is it was all about missing the season, as in the 24-25 season. We're not going to be producing.
Let's just check that. Was it the 24-25?
It was missing the ability to start the research and development so that we would be prepared for subsequent seasons,
which may be 25-26, for example,
and therefore the launch. Timings of the business case were altered and the economics were very different.
Okay, so but which season are we talking about? Because frankly, even, stop me if I'm wrong here, but if you got a sign-off in August, having 390 million quid operational by the next season is going to be a push. Yeah? So which season are we talking about? Because it seems very odd.
Yeah, perhaps if I can clarify. The global business case for this investment was contingent on our ability to launch this new flu vaccine globally. Okay, and it was a reasonably marginal business case to begin with.
What was the target date, Tom, for the launch?
Oh, well, the target date was to launch in the 2029-30 flu season.
I see.
And so the challenge is, if you lose your R&D program at the beginning of August, you can't actually initiate it until the following August, the next flu season, and therefore you lose, in NPV terms, the global value of one first full global flu season. And that's not just in the UK, that's in the US, China, other markets, and the business case was contingent on that launch timeline.
So missing out a couple of months up front actually means you lose a year out.
You lose a year.
I mean,
please pursue the point, Mr. Maynard.
That's very helpful because that wasn't clear until this moment. It still strikes me as odd. We're talking 29-30, so we're talking, what is that, 48 months? Maybe, back in 24, that's actually more like 60 months. Yeah, to be saying 2 months out of 60 or out of it feels odd. Am I being unfair when I say that in terms of that those 2 months really can be caught up over 4 or 5 years?
I think it's not that it's unfair, but it is and was the case that 2 month delay meant we couldn't launch as we had hoped and
29 in autumn 29.
That's correct.
Okay, I'll park that.
Okay, thank you, Sonia Kumar.
You had a vaccine that was prepared and ready, and now this was going to be the R&D was going to be then used to further see whether it was safe, it was a viable option. Is that correct? I need to get the first point right. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have the influenza vaccine that's based on egg manufacture, and that's the manufacturing work that's done at Speak currently. And what we were looking to do was to convert the manufacture of the vaccine from egg to a cell-based approach, which is much more reliable in terms of efficiency and certainty.
And some of this process could not that been done somewhere else in the UK in the interim while you were waiting for this funding package to be agreed?
We needed to be confident on the funding of the R&D and the funding of the construction of the plant in order to proceed with the project at all.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. If I can take you back, you began to talk about your 3 pillars and the way that you assess where you're going to do business, and obviously you speak to governments, presumably all over the world. I just wonder what are the relative strengths of weaknesses of the UK's business environment, and perhaps taking you back to your 3 pillars. You talked about science and R&D, you talked about the general environment, and you talked about the appetite for innovation. So with reference to that, what do you think? How do you think Britain rates?
Yeah, so we think life sciences is a vital strategic area of strength for the UK, and which is why we welcome the industrial strategy and the life science component of that. The life sciences contribute both directly and broaden economic growth. For example, for every AstraZeneca job, we believe that supports a further 6 jobs in the UK. So we're 10,000 people in the United Kingdom, and our calculation is that we support over 70,000 jobs here. We invest £3 billion a year annually in research and development in the UK. That makes us the single largest private investor in R&D in the UK, and we calculate that we contribute £8 billion a year to the economy. So it's a very significant sector for the UK. At the same time, attracting investment in life sciences is a very intense global competition. Lots of other countries are also seeking and pursuing that investment. So it's really important that the UK takes a holistic approach to make sure that we're attracting investment to come here. And because of all the interdependencies, the life science sector touches and is touched by many limbs of government, whether it's science, technology, the NHS, education, environment, and so it makes it even more important that we all work together and create a coordinated, compelling offer to attract companies to invest in life sciences in the UK.
You're obviously heavily invested in the UK, so obviously something about Britain you like, obviously. You did sort of hint at the kind of appetite for innovation, though. You thought that we might have fallen down somewhat on that. What's the difficulty there?
Yeah. So maybe I'll pass to Tom at this point, as Tom leads all our commercial activities in the United Kingdom.
Tom.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's a great privilege to be here, and I've led AstraZeneca in the UK since 2020. So through the COVID pandemic, when I think we saw our industry in life sciences really performing at its best. But I think if you look at the data in terms of the long-term trends, in terms of the UK's international competitiveness, and actually it's accelerated since COVID, you can see that investment in R&D, investment in manufacturing, exports, clinical trial investment actually is growing far faster in other countries than it is in the UK.
I want to just name a couple of countries where we're being outpaced.
Yeah, for sure.
Let me do that, Tom. So in foreign investment terms, the growth between... I've got four quick points. The growth between 2013 and 23 in the UK was 37%. In Australia, it was 400%. In France, it was 377% and 350% in Germany.
Gosh.
And then growth in pharmaceutical exports from the UK in that 10-year time period was 16%, 294% in Belgium and 222% in Canada.
Interesting.
The number of people employed in medicine manufacturing in the UK grew by 3%. It's up 70% in Ireland, 33% in Spain, and 14% in Germany. And then the final point, Tom, the number of people recruited to clinical trials in the UK over that time frame has dropped by a third and increased
really big
49% in the US and 20% in Spain. So there's a real danger that the UK, without us working together to address this, is falling behind.
You're burning to get in.
Well, I was going to respond to Mr. Cooper. So it is true that the UK remains an attractive place for investment, and actually within AstraZeneca since 2020, our R&D investment in the UK has moved up. It's trickled up from £2.5 billion a year to £3 billion a year. But meanwhile, and over the same period, we've put multi-billion pound new investments into Boston, into China, into Canada, into Spain and other countries. And so there is a huge opportunity that the UK is not currently capturing. And Mr. Chair, back to your question in terms of where the UK is competitive and why we see that. Actually, in terms of R&D, the UK remains a powerhouse. But the closer you get to the NHS, clinical trials, and actually bringing innovation to patients, the less and less competitive the UK environment becomes. And, I've been a long-standing advocate for UK life sciences, and it pains me to say this, but at the end, our industry's mission is to bring new medicines all the way through to patients, to change patients' lives, and to improve public health. And the UK really is an outlier now as one of the most difficult places in the world to do that. And as a matter of policy, it gets more and more difficult every year. And so although that is not the direct reason for the failure of us getting some of these investments across the line. And I've been involved in trying to bring a number of global investments to the UK over the last 5 years. It is very difficult to do that when the broader mood music says the UK is a country that does not value innovation.
Anything more?
It's sort of to say, I mean, what are other governments doing then that's right? I mean, apart from throwing the kitchen sink at this, obviously the growth you're talking about there presumably means a lot of money's getting put in. We've got things like yesterday we were a stone's throw away from the Medicines Manufacturing and Innovation Centre just outside Glasgow Airport. Right. But is that a drop in the ocean? Is that just simply not enough?
Yeah, I mean, different countries are obviously taking different approaches. In some cases it's tax incentives, in others it's capital contributions, and they can be very significant, as we experienced in Singapore with the construction of an antibody drug conjugate plant that we decided to establish there. But I think it's important that we're not saying the UK needs to replicate all of those things that are happening around the world. But what the UK really needs to do is to adopt the innovation that's emerging from the UK and elsewhere. So if you're on a global board of a pharmaceutical company and you're deciding where you're going to build a new R&D plant or a factory, if pharmaceutical products actually aren't being adopted here, it makes it very difficult to see the UK as your first choice.
Well, let's zero in on this, because this may simply be, not simply, but this may centre on an issue around NICE and drug licensing. But Sonia Kumar.
So I think NICE rejected 2 of your trials for a new breast screening, advanced breast printing drug in the NHS. What's your thoughts on the NHS and the sort of the NICE's decision on this? And has it affected your sort of thoughts about investing in the UK?
Maybe let me give you a bit of an overall framing of this issue and then come to the question of Enhertu. The UK does not have, in our view, a healthcare funding problem. In England, we invest £180 billion a year in the NHS. And if you compare that to other countries, 11.3% of GDP, we're behind some. Canada, France, the US invest more. But actually, relative to many countries in Europe, the UK is ahead. Where the UK really does stand out, and this came through in Lord Darcy's report, but also in the government's own data, is that NHS spending is really disproportionately focused on hospital and acute care, which is the vast majority, and also increasingly over the last 10 years, manpower. And those two things are crowding out other types of healthcare expenditure. Capital expenditure, Lord Darcy focused on, is increasingly squeezed out. Data and technology infrastructure, primary care, diagnostics, and also medicines. The UK actually invests only 9% of the entire healthcare budget in the UK in medicines. And that, for instance, compares with 18% in Spain, 16 and 17% in France and Germany. And so what we see is a health system that prioritises emergency care in hospitals when patients become extremely sick.
Just pause for a second, so parenthesis almost. What has happened here? Is this basically a consequence of rationing that we've seen as cost pressures have grown more acute over the last decade and a bit?
It's a great question, Mr. Chair, and essentially I have to say it's a matter of policy, a matter of cost management policy. And if we are to achieve a shift left in healthcare toward prevention, in line with the Secretaries of State's strategy, it's going to have to change. And those are the conversations we're now having as part of the sector strategy. When I say it's a matter of policy, the UK's willingness to pay thresholds as defined by NICE were established in 1999, and they haven't moved. So over the last 25 years, you've seen a 54% real terms reduction in the willingness to pay for innovation. And what that means, and we'll come back to the Enhertu example, is we see more and more innovative medicines withdrawing from the NICE process because they simply can't meet that standard. And those that do make it through, we see making it through with increasingly restricted patient populations versus the patient populations in which those medicines have proven to be effective. So UK patients only have access to 28% of fully reimbursed medicines, whereas patients in Germany have access to 87% of those. And that long-term race to the bottom is continuing to mean that patients in the UK are not receiving access to innovation. And that's something in the long term we are going to have to address. Otherwise, this issue is going to continue to accelerate.
As we sit here this afternoon, do you see that curve still in decline over the foreseeable years to come?
Well, as long as those thresholds don't move, by definition in real terms, they are declining. And if I use the Enhertu example, Enhertu is an antibody-drug conjugate for a particularly aggressive form of metastatic breast cancer called HER2-negative breast cancer. 1,000 women in England and Wales are suffering from that, and without treatment they have 18 months to live. Enhertu is approved in 23 healthcare systems across Europe, of course, including Scotland, including countries like Romania. And notwithstanding the fact that we offered patients in England and Wales, actually we don't reveal prices, but it was the lowest price out of those 23 nations. It was still considered to be not low enough by NICE. And so at some level it takes two to tango. Of course, it is a sovereign choice in the UK about how it chooses to value innovation. But what we see over the long term is a depleting access to innovation for patients. And as a life science investor, as I said, it's very, very hard for me to champion the UK as a destination for new R&D or manufacturing or clinical trials if it's impossible for me to bring that innovation to patients. Now, Chair, may I add one other point? And it's particularly topical. Obviously, the adoption of innovation is also very slow in the UK. NHS England is actually not one organisation, it's an archipelago of about 20,000 organisations in England alone. And so median adoption of innovation is very, very slow relative to other countries. But also, and this is completely unique to the UK healthcare system, the government extracts a clawback tax from the life sciences industry by legislation each year, which actually prevents the total market from growing. So even if you get through all of those barriers and do have access, actually growth is taken back by the Department of Health through a clawback. And so in the second half of this year, the Department of Health will take back 32% of all revenues of sales generated in the NHS. That's
revenues.
Revenues. Yeah. Of course, we're also subject to corporation tax. That's up from 15% last year. So firstly, it's highly unpredictable, but it's actually a piece of legislation that prevents...
The clawback is up from 15%?
Yes.
Yeah.
Back to NICE. Is it just payment, or is it any other reasons in terms of the clinical trials, the rigour that goes on those trials that they're looking at into that they've rejected this drug in particular? Because is it just payment that is the only reason?
This trial met all of NICE's evidence standards in terms of clinical efficacy. It improved, as I said, these women on average have 18 months to live, and it improved life expectancy by just over 6 months on average. But yeah, at the end, it came down to the UK attaching a lower value to innovation and extension in these women's lives than 23 other countries in Europe.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move just towards a conclusion on industrial policy in a moment, but just quickly, Joshua Reynolds.
Very, very quickly, you're talking about the clawback that the NHS has, which is understandable in one respect, but then on another respect, you look at last month when it was confirmed that underlying profits for AstraZeneca rose by 58% to $4.2 billion. One could put an argument together that your complaint doesn't really have a lot of merit when you made a profit of $4.2 billion last year.
What I would say is, and we don't actually provide breakdowns of profit or revenue by individual country, And I think you may have covered it earlier, Shaun, but the UK represents just around about 2% of AstraZeneca's global sales. We invest 25% of our global R&D budget in the UK and generate £8 billion worth of gross value added in the UK economy. I can tell you our sales here, our top line, is a very small fraction of that. So of course we can talk about, is there even further cost saving that the NHS can squeeze out of these pennies? But I think the two big opportunities that we need to address through the life sciences strategy, firstly, is how we take this 8 billion of investment and grow it. This is a very fast growing, as you say, global industry, and we want to bring more to the UK. But also, how do we switch from thinking about medicines as only a cost and partner with the NHS to actually get evidence-based care to patients, to keep them well, to keep them out of hospital, to make them productive, keep them in the workforce? These two opportunities should be absolute engines of life sciences strategy and economic growth, and it's something that we should be doing, as we did through COVID, in partnership. Otherwise, we're locked in a race to the bottom, and that's in no one's interests.
The policies are both depriving patients of breakthrough medicines, but also disincentivising pharmaceutical companies from making further investment.
We've been very generous with the time. The clock is slightly against us. I'm going to ask Mr. Weston just to help us wrap up. But we would love your conclusions about the kind of priorities that you would set out for the government's industrial strategy for life science. I'm also just quite interested in your observations on the Office of Life Science and how effective you find that as a place for bringing the public and the private sector together. But Mr. Weston.
Yes, thank you for that. It's interesting what the comments you've been making. I'm just interested to know, in the light of Theresa May's life science sector deal, what happened from that? It wasn't that many years ago that was introduced by Greg Clark, I believe, alongside Theresa May. What happened in terms of the success or not of that? And what is the current status of the relations with government, between government and the sector? Be honest.
Yeah.
Just be straight.
I'm very happy to
we are trying to learn the lessons. I mean, you've taken us to a very interesting place. We started with trying to understand what happened with Speak, but we've gone in an interesting direction that we need to understand.
Look, the Office for Life Sciences does great work. And we also have actually a Life Sciences Council on which our Chief Executive sits with a number of members of the Cabinet. And those are extremely productive forums for cross-departmental discussion, I would say. And anybody who's followed life sciences strategy and new deals over the course of the last 20 years will be aware of the myriad policy documents which have talked about the need for change along the lines that I've articulated. But if you look at the data in Lord Darcy's report, actually those trends have not shifted at all. None of those lines have been bent. We continue to invest more and more in manpower and acute care and less in other aspects of healthcare. And the opportunity that we now have as part of this life sciences strategy once and for all is to move these forums from being forums of discussion to being forums of action, to unlock the opportunity that we have to increase investment in the UK and partner together to improve public health.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just echo that, I think the contact and interactions we have with the OLS is good. They're approachable. We meet with them frequently, but thus far that's not resulted in any meaningful change or improvement from our perspective, certainly from the adoption of innovation. And then just to echo Tom, the Life Science Council, other sectors look at the Life Science Council with some envy, that it's where ministers and CEOs can get together. But that really does need to move into more of a decision-making and policy-driving body, rather than everybody showing up and just talking about how difficult everything is.
I mean, on that, I mean, we've always been told, I think, that one of the benefits of the NHS is we have a huge data pool, and that is a massive advantage to the pharma healthcare sector. So I don't see we should have a massive advantage here. You said 25% research and development in the UK. What would it have been, say, 10 years ago? You must know. What was it?
For the UK? For
yeah,
AstraZeneca?
UK. What was it? 25% is currently UK?
Yeah, so my sense is that that's been fairly consistent in terms of the proportion of AstraZeneca's UK R&D in the UK.
Okay. I don't have that data top of my mind, but we can provide it.
Right.
Over the last decade, we've moved from 3 global R&D centres, of which one was in Cambridge in the UK, to having 5. So I imagine that number has slowly come down to 25% as we've invested elsewhere. But I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue.
Fair enough.
Will do.
Just in terms of the relationship across government and how, say, DHSC is working as a customer alongside the NHS with, say, DBT, how is that relationship working in your eyes? Either of you.
I mean, for me, it's a little bit early with the new government to comment on interaction between those two departments.
Here we go.
I think historically, life sciences policy has been a little bit cakeist. And what I mean by that is medicines and innovation policy in the NHS has been completely independent from a strategy to attract industry investments into the UK, and those two arms of government and those two policy agendas have acted independently, and I think government has assumed that there's no link between the two. COVID really changed that. I think the step up in the rebate rates that I've discussed, the race to the bottom in terms of willingness to pay is really now starting to deny patients access to innovation in the UK, and actually it's become something that's really urgent. And the feedback that we've been giving to all departments across government through this life sciences process is that we do really now need to join the dots and come up with a strategy to generate growth in partnership on both of those dimensions.
Do you think the Industrial Strategy Council is going to succeed? Is it going to work in your eyes for the sector?
I don't have any personal experience of the Industrial Council. As I said, our Chief Executive sits on the Life Sciences Council, which works under the auspices of the Industrial Council. And Shaun, you've been sitting on that on behalf of Pascal.
Yeah, I would say as British citizens, as representatives of a valuable British company, our deep hope is that it will succeed, and AstraZeneca will do whatever it can to support that, because we are at a period of risk, and we need to work together to affect some of these changes.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. So if you just gave us your top 3 asks for industrial strategy in life sciences, adoption of innovation feels like it's at the top. Just give me a couple of other points for the list.
I mean, from my perspective, the most urgent is we've got to address this extraordinary clawback tax. I think if we don't find a shared solution to that, the life sciences strategy just doesn't pass go.
Yeah.
It's unique to this industry. It's the only one of the 8 growth industries where this type of legislation is applied, and it's just not sustainable. So I think we've got to address that.
Yeah.
We've got to address the long-term willingness to pay. I said it's a race to the bottom, which, okay, if you don't fix it in the next 12 months, we may be able to survive, but it's absolutely unsustainable for the next 10 years. And of course, the Secretary of State for Health has talked about shift left, the desire to partner with the industry to accelerate the adoption of equitable access to innovation for patients. And let's hope that the changes that we've seen announced last week are a first step in that direction.
So, Mr. Chair, beyond adoption of innovation, I think there are 2 or 3 things we'd share with you. We suggested in the spending review that the government actually consider increasing public expenditure in R&D. We said earlier that we do pretty well in the UK, but there's an opportunity to really differentiate the United Kingdom. We've expressed support for prioritising the Ox-Cam growth corridor. Being based in Cambridge, that's perhaps not surprising, but we think prioritising the Oxford-Cambridge linkage, the supercluster board themselves assess an estimated £78 billion worth of additional value add by 2035. So that's an area that we've flagged to government as being hugely important for the growth creation from the life science sector.
Perfect. Well, that takes us to the end of our panel. That has been extremely useful evidence. Thank you both for sparing the time to join us this afternoon. Has really helped us with some of the conclusions that we've got to draw. That concludes this panel and that concludes this session.